On February 24th, 1983, a 21-year-old man named Don Decker walked into a funeral home in the tiny rural town of Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, where Don's grandfather's funeral was being held. And as soon as Don walked inside, he saw his grandfather's casket open for viewing at the front of the room, and then he also saw lots of his family members and friends of his grandfather kind of kneeled around the casket and, sitting in the front seats of this funeral home, and everybody is quietly crying and kind of consoling each other. But Don, he walks in and he doesn't talk to anybody in his family, doesn't talk to any of the friends, he doesn't go up to his grandfather's casket. Instead, Don sat down in the very last row of seats, he folded his arms, and just scowled angrily as he looked around the room. Unlike everybody else inside of this funeral home, Don was not remotely sad. He was instead just totally angry. In fact, as he was sitting there, he was clenching his fists so hard out of fury that his fingernails were practically cutting into his skin. Don had come to this funeral home directly from the Monroe County Correctional Facility, where he was serving a 4 to 12-month sentence for receiving stolen property. The jail had granted Don a furlough, which is a temporary leave of absence, so he could go to his grandfather's funeral. And Don had jumped at the opportunity, mostly just to get out of jail for a minute, but now that he was actually at the funeral, he kind of regretted going. Eventually, the actual funeral began, and one by one, Don's family members would go up to the podium and say something nice about the grandfather, and then sit back down. And at first, Don, he put up with it, but after a couple people had spoken, Don was just livid. He just couldn't hear any more. And so he tried to focus his attention just on his grandfather's casket, where he could literally see his grandfather's face as he was laying there. And as he was staring at his grandfather's face, suddenly Don saw something and he stood up really suddenly in his seat. And in fact, when he stood up, it immediately caught the attention of the speaker, which was Don's cousin, and the cousin just stopped and stared at Don. And at that point, the rest of the people in the funeral also turned around and looked at Don. And Don, he knew people were looking at him, but he didn't care anymore. He was now so focused on his grandfather because a second ago, he could have sworn he saw his grandfather's lips moving like he was still alive. But as Don continued to stare at his grandfather, expecting his lips to move again, they didn't, and so finally Don didn't say a word to all these people who were still staring at him, and he just turned and stalked out of the funeral home. Once Don was outside, he thought for a second about heading to the home where he knew his whole family would be going after the funeral, but Don just could not face being around that crowd again, and so instead, he headed to his friend's home. It was this couple named Bob and Jeannie Kiefer, and the reason Don wanted to see them is he knew they were just kind of laid-back people who would not ask him a lot of questions, and they would just kind of let him have some peace and quiet. And really all Don wanted between now and 2 days from now, when he had to go back to jail when his furlough ended, was just to have some peace and quiet. And so Don made his way to their house, and when he got there, Bob and Jeannie were so excited to see him. They called him inside and said, hey, we're going to make dinner, go wash up and relax, and we'll eat together. Don didn't say much, but, he nodded a thank you, he went inside, and right away he went upstairs to the bathroom and splashed some cold water on his face because still, Don just could not shake that anger he was feeling when he was inside the funeral home. And for a second, the splashing of water on his face seemed to be working. He felt like his whole body was getting cooler. In fact, the whole bathroom seemed to have this coolness descend on it. But a weird thing started to happen. Don, as he's feeling this kind of cool come over him, he realized it was actually getting so cold in the bathroom, literally, like physically cold in the bathroom, that it was becoming uncomfortable, like he was cold. And then when Don just happened to look up at the mirror right in front of him, he could have sworn for a second he saw on the edge of the mirror the face of an old man wearing a gold crown. And immediately Don, he kind of freaked out and turned around, but there was nothing there. And as he's like shivering from the cold from being in this bathroom, he began looking all around him, trying to find this old man with a crown on his head, but obviously there was nothing in the bathroom with him. And so Don felt totally unsettled by this. He didn't understand why it was so cold. He didn't know what he had just seen. And then Don happened to look down at his wrists, and he saw there were these deep scratches all over both of his wrists. And so kind of in a panic, Don just rolled his sleeves down to cover up whatever was on his wrists. He didn't want to think about it. He turned off the water and sprinted out of that freezing cold bathroom and just made his way downstairs where Bob and Jeannie were just sitting down for dinner. So Don, he took his seat, he got his food, and he didn't tell Bob or Jeannie about anything that had just happened up in the bathroom. He just sat there and ate in silence. Now, Bob and Jeannie could clearly tell something was on Don's mind, but they'd known him for years, and they knew he was just not the type to come out and talk about anything personal. He basically completely kept to himself, and then when he spoke, he was kind of oddly flat and monotone and emotionless. That was just who he was. But, he didn't cause any problems. He was a very nice guy. And so for this entire meal, Bob and Jeannie just kind of looked at Don, but didn't ask him any questions and just let him eat in peace. After the trio was done eating, Jeannie gathered up their dishes and headed to the kitchen to wash up, and Bob and Don headed to the living room where they sat down and Bob turned on the TV, and for a few minutes the two friends just watched TV. But at some point, Bob realized when he looked over at Don that Don was not really looking at the TV. He was actually looking down at the ground. It was like he was just sitting there motionless, just staring off into space. And Bob thought to himself, wow, Don must be catatonic with grief here from losing his grandfather. But Bob, he felt really bad for Don, but he had no idea what to say to him. He knew Don was not about to launch into some deep story about how he was feeling. And so Bob just sat there and said nothing, hoping that, just his physical presence next to Don was comforting in some way to Don during this really difficult time. And so a few minutes goes by, and the two men are still silently sitting in their seats, when Bob begins to hear what sounds like running water. And at first, he looked over at Don, thinking maybe Don had spilled a drink on the ground, but Don didn't have a drink. Don was still just sitting there catatonic, staring at the ground in front of him. And then, Bobby turned and looked towards the kitchen, thinking maybe Jeannie had spilled a drink, but she didn't appear to have done that. And then Bob felt a drop of water land on his head. And so he looked up and he saw water was coming through the ceiling. And so right away, Bob stood up and he yelled to his wife that a pipe had burst. And then he grabbed his phone and he called his landlord, who lived right nearby, and said, you got to get over here. There's a pipe that's burst in your house. And just a couple of minutes later, the landlord and his wife arrived at the house. The landlord ran inside and he and Bob rushed upstairs to try to find the origin of this leak. And when they got up there, they looked everywhere and there was no obvious sign of where water could be leaking from. The toilet wasn't overflowing, neither was the sink. They couldn't hear the sound of running water anywhere. And then they also realized as they're walking around upstairs that where the leak was coming through the ceiling above the living room, they went to that rough area above the living room, and the landlord was like, there's no plumbing over this area. There should be absolutely no water anywhere near where the water was coming through. And so Bob and the landlord were very confused, and they began walking downstairs to try to figure out what else they could do. And when they walked downstairs, two things happened very quickly. The first was, as they came down the stairs, they were entering the living room where the leak had originally been noticed. And when they walked back into the living room, they saw right away that this leak had grown, and it was now not just coming out of the ceiling of the living room, but it was also now leaking out of the walls of the living room. Basically, all the different walls and surfaces in the living room were leaking water. And then the second thing they noticed was Dawn. Dawn was still sitting on the couch, still just totally catatonic, staring at the ground, not doing anything, which made no sense. Everybody else in the house is running around trying to figure out this leak, and there's Dawn just staring at the ground. And so Bob, who at this point is pretty overwhelmed with what's happening here, but he thought, I gotta make sure Dawn's okay. And so he just walked through the leaking living room right over to Dawn, and he said, Dawn, are you okay? And Dawn, he didn't say anything, he didn't move, but his mouth kind of contorted into this weird smile with his lips kind of pulling away from his teeth, and all the tendons on the top of his hands began to tense as he wiggled his fingers. And Bob, at this point, he realized there's something wrong with Dawn, and they needed to call the police. Two police officers named John Bojan and Richard Wolbert arrived at Bob and Jeannie's house. And so they came inside, and Bob quickly tried to explain what was going on. But John and Richard, they walked inside and immediately saw, okay, something totally weird is happening here. Because they looked into the living room and they saw water coming down from the ceiling, coming out of the walls. It was even bubbling up all over the floor. And in the middle of all this chaos was one person, Dawn, who's just sitting there totally erect, not moving, wiggling his fingers with this weird expression on his face. And the police very quickly said to Bob that, we don't know what this is. We don't even know how to help. So we're going to get our police chief. And as soon as those officers left, it was like Bob, Jeannie, the landlord, the landlord's wife, they were now scared to be in this house. Before, it was just baffling. But now, with Don sitting there tapping his fingers with that weird grimace on his face and water coming out of everywhere for no reason, it was like terrifying. And so the four of them just kind of huddled in the dining room staring at Dawn and the living room until finally the two officers came back with their police chief. But once the chief came inside, things did not get any better because the chief walked inside and he saw how totally weird this was. But his reaction was, this is not a police problem. You clearly have some sort of totally weird plumbing issue that seems very extensive, and your friend, he seems okay, he's just acting really weird. And so the chief told his two officers, John and Richard, to not talk about what they saw in this house and just leave, don't report it, get out of here, we're done with this. And just like that, John, Richard, the police chief, they said, okay guys, your problem, and they left. And then Bob and Jeannie's landlord was like, okay, we're gonna get a plumber over here right away, and you can deal with this. And then they left. And so Bob and Jeannie at this point are totally unsettled, and they just stood in the dining room staring over at the living room where Don was just sitting there tapping his fingers, water's leaking all around him. And then finally a plumber came to the house and they searched the whole house and they could not find anywhere where there was a leak. It literally didn't make sense that the living room was still leaking water. And so Bob, he contacted his landlord and said, what do you want me to do? And the landlord said, you know what? I don't know. We'll send out more plumbers tomorrow. We'll figure it out. And so Bob and Jeannie, they just put out as many towels and blankets as they could all over the living room, doing their best to kind of sop up the water. The whole time they're glancing over at Don, who's still not moving, tapping his fingers, sitting on the couch. And then finally, after Bob and Jeannie had exhausted their towel and blanket supply trying to sop up all this water, they're like, what can we even do? It's still leaking. We can't stop it. We don't know what's going on with Don. And so the couple just sat in the dining room staring into the living room, basically at Don, just kind of waiting for him to maybe break out of his trance. And eventually Don would, break out of his trance, kind of. Instead of, suddenly standing up and talking to Bob and Jeannie, he just eventually kind of dozed off, still in the upright sitting position. And so at this point, Bob walked over to Don just to check on him and make sure he was breathing and that he was okay. And so he checked and, he was, Don was okay. But Bob noticed that on Don's neck were all these dark red scratches and marks, like someone had been strangling him. And then also on the inside of Don's collar was a little bit of blood. And so Bob, he calls over Jeannie and he's like, what do you make of this? And she's like, I don't know. This whole thing, I don't know what's going on here. And so the couple decided they would just go to bed. Don seems like he's okay. He's sleeping on the couch. We can't fix the water, so that's all we can do. And so the couple, they went upstairs, they went to bed, and the next morning when they came back down, the living room was still leaking, and Don was wide awake again, back in that sitting position, tapping his fingers with this bizarre grimace on his face. And all day that day, and all day the next day, that's where Don would stay, in that position, only stopping to fall asleep, still in that position. And over those 2 days, all these plumbers and different people came over the house and nobody could figure out where this leak was coming from. And so the water just continued to pool inside of the living room. And then finally, on February 26th, so 2 days after Don had arrived at Bob and Jeannie's house, Don suddenly stood up. He didn't say a word to Bob or Jeannie. He just walked out of the house. And as soon as he did, all the water that was leaking out of the ceiling and the walls stopped. Don would go back to prison, and when he walked into his cell, his cellmate took one look at Don, and apparently the look on Don's face was so unsettling that the cellmate immediately called over one of the guards and said, you gotta get me out of the cell. I can't be in here with this guy. And so this cellmate and the guard, they both turned and looked at Don, and Don, he was at the back of the cell and he was facing both of them. And when they looked at Don, that totally weird grimace came across his face, the same one he had on as he sat in Bob and Jeannie's house for those 2 days. It was the same expression, and with that expression on his face, in this totally creepy kind of hollow voice, he says to the two men, I can make it rain. Now, the cellmate was terrified of Don and was practically screaming for the guard to let him leave the cell, but the guard, who was definitely unsettled by Don and his behavior, he was less scared and more just kind of intrigued with what Don had just said, and he said, okay, hey Don, if you can make it rain, then why don't you make it rain in the warden's office? And after the guard said this, Don's expression, that kind of creepy, weird smile he had, it grew larger and larger until he had this totally bizarre smile on his face, exposing all of his teeth. At this point, the guard now felt totally terrified of Don and understood why the cellmate was so scared of him, and kind of instinctively, the guard just turned and ran into the warden's office to tell the warden what was going on with this guy. But when he got into the warden's office, he looked at the warden, Dave Keenhold was his name, and he was sitting at his desk doing some paperwork, and Dave looked up at the guard, and the guard realized on Dave's chest, his shirt, there was this wet spot that was growing slowly all over his chest, and it was almost like the warden didn't realize it was happening. And so Dave looks up at the guard and he's like, what's going on? And the guard, he just points at Dave's chest and says, look! And so the guard told the warden about what he had just witnessed in the jail cell and how he had kind of jokingly told Don to make it rain in the warden's office, and now there's this wet patch on your shirt, what's going on here? And the warden, he looked down and he was just as caught off guard by this wet spot on his shirt. And so he leapt up and he and the guard ran back to Don's jail cell. And when they got there, they couldn't believe what they saw. Water was pouring out of the ceiling. It was coming out of the ground. Even the bars were leaking water. And there was Don in the back of the cell, standing there with that terrible smile on his face, and his fingers were contorting. All the tendons were all tight in his hand, and his cellmate was practically crying, huddled in the corner. And so right away, Warden Keenhold moved the cellmate out of that cell, put him in another cell, and then shut the cell where Don was. And then the warden called a plumber to come out here and stop this leak from wherever it was coming from. But the plumber came to the jail, and no matter where he looked, he could not find anything that would cause this leak inside of this jail cell. It just didn't make sense. And in fact, the plumber was so scared of Don, who the whole time this inspection is happening, he's standing in the back, wiggling his fingers with this bizarre look on his face. The plumber was so scared of Don that after he told the warden that he couldn't find a leak, he just left without even being paid. He just had to get away from Don. Now, Warden Keenhold had no idea what was happening with Don, but he could tell it was well beyond his own expertise, and frankly, he had no idea who he should call about what was going on. And so he just called the jail's minister and asked him to come over and see what was going on. But when the Reverend got there and saw Don and saw all the water in the cell, he too had no idea what to do. But when the Reverend walked up to the bars to get a closer look at Don began to move in the cell as well towards the Reverend. And Don, he would stop about halfway through the cell, and when he did, the Reverend stopped as well. And they were kind of looking at each other, and then Don, he raised up his right arm into the air. And when he did, more and more water began pouring into the cell, and also this terrible rotting smell filled the entire jail. It smelled like death. And the Reverend, he was horrified by it, and Don, he was just grinning with his arm up, and then he brought his arm down and began rubbing his hands together and just staring at the Reverend. At this point, the Reverend grabbed his Bible and began reading passages accusing Don of being possessed by Satan, and he was reading all these passages from the Bible to try to banish this evil spirit from Don. And then suddenly, Don just let out this horrible guttural scream that was so loud, the Reverend had to stop and cover his ears, and so did the warden and the guard and the cellmate. And then after he let out this horrible scream, it was like Don snapped back to reality and he just collapsed on the ground and began sobbing. It would take Don a long time to finally open up about what the heck had just happened to him, but he would eventually open up to his friends Bob and Jeannie. And while his explanation for what he went through did explain some aspects of what occurred between February 24th and 26th of 1983, it did not explain everything. Don and his grandfather had been very close. However, when Don was just 7 years old, his grandfather began abusing him physically. Don had kept the violence a secret for his entire life, but he had come to view his grandfather as the human embodiment of evil. And so when his grandfather passed away, Don frankly was relieved to find out his grandfather was dead. But when he went to the funeral and he saw all of his loved ones talking about his grandfather as being this incredible person, so loving, so kind, it totally infuriated Don. And as he felt this anger growing inside of him, Don could have sworn he saw his dead grandfather's lips move. And at the time, Don had no idea what to make of it, but he would later say that he believes that was the moment that his evil grandfather's spirit basically possessed him. And Don would say when he got to Bob and Jeannie's house, he began to feel like there was something wrong with him, but he couldn't stop whatever it was. It was like there was somebody else in his brain making him do and say things that he didn't want to do, but he just couldn't stop it. And so he had gone upstairs to the bathroom in Bob and Jeannie's house, hoping to splash some water on his face and make himself feel better. And that was when he saw that old man's face. Well, that face was his grandfather's face. He was wearing that crown. And Don would say he thinks the reason he was wearing a crown is because it signified he had all the power over Don. And then also Don had those scratches on his wrists, which he thought was his grandfather as well. He went downstairs and tried to tell himself that everything was okay. But after Don sat down on the couch, he said he couldn't move anymore. It was like his grandfather had totally took over, and he locked him on the couch with that bizarre contorted expression, and he kept moving Don's hands around. And then obviously the water began leaking in the room for no reason, which Don says was entirely his grandfather. He was just trying to scare all of Don's friends and Don himself. It was his way of tormenting Don a little bit more. And then again at the jail, when the same scene kind of unfolded, Don believed it was his evil grandfather inflicting just a little bit more pain and torment. For almost a decade after this happened, everybody involved in this didn't really talk about it publicly, especially the police and the jailers. They did not talk about what they witnessed because they were worried talking about it publicly would make them look like crazy people and they'd get fired. But eventually in the 90s, 9 people, including 4 police officers and the jail warden, would officially go on the record and testify to what they saw happening. And it would include Don seeming totally deranged and in a trance-like state as water just poured into these rooms that he was in. To this day, we do not have an explanation for what happened to Don. The only explanation that seems to make sense is that Don really was possessed by his evil grandfather. Also, it should be noted that Don never made it rain again. The only times that happened were in Bob and Jeannie's house and in that jail cell from February 24th to February 26th, 1983. After that, Don lived a totally normal life. On the morning of June 18th, 2016, a 45-year-old hiker named Zhang Shenpeng stood at the entrance to the famous Maclehose Wilderness Trail in southern China. He reached into his backpack, pulled out his phone, aimed it at the trail, and took a photo. Now, this trail was very beautiful, which is why he was taking a photo of it, but it also had a reputation for being a very dangerous trail. It was located in an area called the Saikung Peninsula, and the trail itself was about 100 kilometers long, or 62 miles. And it went through forests and mountains and streams, and the weather along this trail was very unpredictable, with sudden storms rolling in and just wreaking havoc. But Zhang was feeling very confident about this hike because he himself was an experienced hiker. While he maybe hadn't done this particular trail, he had hiked similar trails, and also the weather appeared to be holding up. However, before Zhang could even take a step onto this trail, the sky suddenly turned this dark greenish hue, and there was a loud thunderclap. I mean, basically instantly, there was this massive storm overhead. Zhang couldn't believe it. He just stood there watching as this unbelievable storm rolled in, wondering what he should do. I mean, again, he had not prepared for a storm. It was supposed to be nice out. But as he's kind of weighing whether or not he should just turn around and head back home because it was now too dangerous, the sky, just as suddenly as this all began, cleared. And it was suddenly beautiful and bright out, and the storm was gone. Now, at first, Zhang was not entirely convinced that the storm was now just magically gone, and so for a few minutes, he just stood there waiting in case it came back. But it didn't. The sky remained beautiful and clear. And so eventually, Zhang posted that photo he had taken of the trail, and he captioned it with something to the effect of, very strange weather out here, but I'm continuing my hike. And then after posting the photo, he put his phone away and began walking down the Maclehose Trail. At first, as Zhang headed off into the forest, he made good time. It was warm out, but not too hot, and his pack was fairly light. And also, the views were just stunning. Every time he came to a rise on the trail, he could look out and see the waves of the South China Sea, and the air was so clear and crisp. I mean, it was a really relaxing and beautiful place to be. Certainly a big change from what he was used to, which was the noise and crowds of the city. And so Zhang just continued on his hike, stopping periodically to take more photos. But after about an hour of this hike, when things were still going really well, Zhang reached this fairly steep incline on the trail, and he began walking up it. There had been past inclines on the trail, and he had been fine. But as he began maneuvering up this particular incline, he began to feel kind of woozy.
In fact, more specifically, he began to feel like the air all around him was getting really hot, like somebody was turning up the temperature all around him. And so Zhang, he stopped as he was making his way up this incline to kind of catch his breath. But as he did that, the heat just got worse and worse. He became delirious. And as he was almost towards the top of this hill, it was like he just couldn't go any further. And the world began to spin all around him. And before long, he was tumbling to the ground and blacking out. The next thing Zhang became aware of was the feeling of grass pressed up against his cheek. He was laying on the trail. So he kind of opened his eyes, he sat up for a second, he was very disoriented. He didn't know how long he had been out for. He figured it was only a couple of minutes. But as he kind of got his bearings, the first thing he noticed is the sky was now totally dark. And when he had passed out, it was broad daylight. And so he's thinking, that can't possibly be true. I can't have been here for hours. That's not possible. And so he began to think to himself like, oh, I guess another storm has rolled in. That's why the sky is so dark. It's not nighttime. But then when he reached into his bag and pulled out his phone and saw the time and saw it was 8 o'clock at night, he realized there was no storm. It really is nighttime. He had been unconscious on this trail for apparently like 12 hours. And so as Zhang just stared at his phone in disbelief, his phone began to ring, and it was his wife. And so Zhang's thinking, oh my goodness, I'm supposed to be home right now. My wife is definitely worried about me. And so pretty quickly he kind of composed himself, even though again, he has no idea what's happening here. And he answers the call, and as cheerful as he could, he told his wife that everything was fine, he was just running late and he would be home soon. And so she said, okay. And then after Zhang hung up with her, he put his phone back in his backpack and pulled out a flashlight. And then he stood up and kind of checked himself over for cuts and scrapes and bruises. He had no idea what condition he was in here. But after checking himself over, he seemed okay. He was still very disoriented and confused, but physically he was okay. And then again, even though he doesn't understand what's happening here, he's just thinking, okay, I gotta turn around, get back to the car, and get home as quickly as possible. And so he slung his backpack, and with his flashlight out in front of him, he just started hoofing it back down the trail in the direction of his car. Now, as Zhang walked along, he was feeling very unsettled, but he kept telling himself that, independent of whatever's happened here, he was gonna be home soon, and everything was gonna be fine. However, not long into his return trip towards his car, he began to get this unbelievably bad feeling, like something was just totally wrong here. And as he began having this feeling, he suddenly took stock of the fact that the forest he was in, which had been so alive with life and sound and everything, was now completely silent. No insects, no animals. The stream nearby was making no sound. It was like he was in a void. And it was so eerie. And he stopped and just listened, and it was like the whole world was on mute. And so Zhang, who now is starting to feel scared, just began scanning his flashlight all around him, not even sure what he was looking for. But as he did, he had another realization. Suddenly the area he was in did not look familiar at all. He had only walked maybe several paces away from where he had just fallen to the trail and passed out. But now as he looked around, it was like he was in a totally different section of the forest. He looked back where he had fallen, and even in the grass where he would have been, it was untouched. There was no impression on the ground from where he would have been laying for 12 hours, like he'd been transported somewhere else without knowing it. Now, when Zhang spoke to his wife on the phone, he was very careful not to alarm her, even though he had sort of a growing sense of panic inside of him. But now, the whole situation was sort of out of hand. He really didn't understand what was happening, and he knew he needed help. And so he reached into his backpack to pull out his phone to call for help, except when he reached into his bag, there was nothing there. His phone was gone, his supplies were gone, the bag was totally empty, even though literally minutes before it had been full. Like there was no way he just randomly lost this stuff. It had been there, and now it was gone. And so Zhang desperately looked on the ground with his flashlight, and he walked back in the direction where he believed he had fallen, even though it didn't look like the same place. He's looking all over the place like, maybe he did drop his stuff, but he didn't. It was just gone. And so now, really feeling scared, Zhang just completely lost his composure and began screaming at the top of his lungs for help. But he heard nothing in response, just silence. And then not long after that, Zhang's head began to feel heavy again, and then he sank to the ground, put his head in the dirt, and he closed his eyes.
Hey guys, I have an incredible announcement. Something I know is going to absolutely make your day. Something many of you may have waited years for me to say again. Beginning the first full week in the new year, so the week of January 5th, I am gonna go from one measly upload on this channel a week to 2, 3, even 4 uploads a week. You heard that right, we're going back to 2, 3, even 4 times a week. You guys have been telling me that you want me to release more videos, and well, I and our whole team have been listening. So as always, make sure your notifications are on so you don't miss any of these amazing extra weekly uploads. It will not replace what you're already getting. This is all in addition to. It's gonna be great. See you guys soon.
When Zhang woke up, it was bright out, and he also was now magically back at the original spot where he had passed out on that steep incline. And the first thing he did as soon as he came to is he reached into his bag, hoping that his phone and other supplies would have just materialized by now. But no, when he reached inside the bag, it was still empty. And so on the one hand, Zhang still is like, what is going on here? I don't understand what's happening. And then on the other, he was also becoming acutely aware that because he doesn't have his phone, he can't call for help, like he's stuck out here. And so he's wondering, like, what is he gonna do here? And then it dawns on him that, it's been at least several hours since he last spoke to his wife, and she was expecting him home the night before. And so by now, certainly, because he hasn't come home, she must have called the police. And so maybe there was already a search party out here looking for him. And so suddenly feeling kind of hopeful that that was actually happening, Zhang, despite his confusion and disorientation here, just scooped up his backpack, put it on, and began walking down the trail back in the direction towards his car. And as he walked, Zhang periodically would call out, hoping that again, some searchers or other hikers were nearby who would hear him and come to his aid. But after hiking for over an hour, he still had not reached his car. The forest was still eerily silent, like everything was silent. He hadn't seen or heard anybody else. I mean, he's totally alone here. And so Zhang started to wonder if maybe his best bet was not to try to hike out of here, but instead to just stay put and wait for, hopefully, the search party, if there was one out there, to come find him, or maybe some other hiker to come find him. However, as he was considering this, he looked up ahead where the trail kind of turned, and he saw there was this pond, a pond he had not seen on the way in, but nonetheless, there was a pond basically right over there. And from his perspective, he could see kind of through the trees on the other side of the pond appeared to be a person. Zhang suddenly felt this enormous sense of relief. Here was the person who was going to help him and get him out of here. And so Zhang began walking towards this person, and as he did, he cupped his hands and he called out a hello to get this person's attention. Now, when Zhang did this, he believed this person would either, 1, hear him, turn around and see what Zhang wanted, or 2, they wouldn't hear him, and they would just continue to stand there with their back to him. But neither of those things happened. When Zhang called out this very hearty hello, this person just instantly began sprinting away from Zhang without even turning to look at him. They just began taking off into the trees. And Zhang, he's thinking like this is a crisis for him. He has no idea what's happening here. This is the first person he's seen. He needs them. And so instinctively, Zhang just took off running after them, calling out the whole time, trying to reassure them that he was not a threat. He didn't mean to scare them. He needs their help. And so he gets to the pond. He runs around the perimeter. He can still see this person running off into the woods. And Zhang, like he's so exhausted from the lack of water and food, he's not feeling his best, but somehow through adrenaline alone, he starts gaining on this person. And eventually he closes the distance on this person as they're weaving through the trees. And suddenly this person just stops. And they don't turn around to look at Zhang, they just stop in the middle of the woods. And Zhang, he almost barrels into them because he had been running so quickly, and he just stops. And he's staring at the back of this person who still has not turned around to look at him at any point. And Zhang says to them, "Please, I need your help." And Zhang, he's panting, he's totally out of breath. And this person who's been running at top speed the whole time, they're not out of breath. They're not even moving. They're stationary, just with their back to Zhang. And suddenly, as Zhang is staring at this person, realizing that something feels off here, the person begins to turn around to look at him. And as they do, Zhang suddenly feels this incredible sense of dread. Like he chased this person down, he needs their help, but now that they're turning around to face him, something feels wrong and he doesn't want to see him. Something's off here. And then the person fully turns around and looks at Zhang, And Zhang is suddenly so terrified of what he sees, he holds his breath and just stays there frozen to the spot staring. He can't believe what he's looking at. This was not a person. This was some sort of shadowy figure with no face, and it was now staring directly at Zhang. And Zhang, again, he's so scared he can't move, he's holding his breath, he's just looking right back at them, and then suddenly this figure takes an aggressive step toward Zhang, and then another, and another, until suddenly they're inches away from Zhang, and Zhang is so terrified, he just closes his eyes, expecting to die at any second, and then when he opens his eyes, the figure's just gone. For about 5 minutes, Zhang just stood there, shaking in utter disbelief of what he had just experienced. I mean, this whole thing had been terrifying, but this specific interaction with this shadow figure was horrifying, and he had no idea how to process it. But at the same time, after a few minutes, Zhang's thinking to himself, I don't want to stay around here to try to figure out what's going on. I need to get out of here. And so Zhang finally, after mustering the courage, he turns to start walking back towards the pond and back up to the trail. But when he turns around, the pond isn't there anymore. It's just this endless expanse of trees. The pond should have been right there, and it's gone. And also, when Zhang took off running after this shadow figure, it was daylight. And now, it's darkness. It's total darkness. And so once again, Zhang has somehow gone to a new location and jumped through time, several hours at least, with no idea how that had even happened. And also, as he's having this realization that once again, it's like space-time has changed all around him, he starts to have that heaviness in his head, things start to swim all around him, and before long, he's fallen to the ground and he's closing his eyes. When Zhang woke up again, it was now suddenly bright out. So again, more time has passed. He was not just passed out for a minute or two, it was several hours at least. And also, Zhang was now magically laying right next to the pond that had vanished the night before after this figure had showed up. And so at this point, Zhang is seriously thinking to himself that he must have lost his mind. That's what's happening here. He's gone insane. Or does he have some horrible head injury that's like causing hallucinations or something? Like, he doesn't know. But at the same time, all he can do at this point is just get up, try to get back to the trail, and try to get back to his car and get back home. That's all he can do. And so that's what he did. Zhang made his way back up to the trail and began walking down the trail in the direction that he believed was back towards his car. But after hiking for a while, things did not look any more familiar. It was like he was hiking down a brand new trail that he had never been on before. The forest continued to be eerily silent, and every time he called out for help, he got nothing in response. And then eventually, Zhang reached a section of the trail that kind of sloped down, and when he got there and he looked out ahead of him, he saw down below there was this huge cemetery. Now, Zhang had studied this entire area before coming out on this hike, and he knew there was no cemetery in the middle of the MacLehose Trail. Like, this can't be here. But remember, by this point, Zhang has seen and experienced things that he cannot understand. So he doesn't even know what's real and what's not anymore. And so as he's looking at the cemetery, he told himself, this has got to be some hallucination. This can't be here. But after walking down the hill and entering the cemetery, he reached out and touched the headstones, and they were very real. This cemetery absolutely, for right now anyways, was real and right in front of him. And as he looked at the dates on these headstones, he could tell the cemetery was at least 200 years old. And so as Zhang is taking in this new information, he looks up and he sees a couple hundred meters away from him is a group of what appears to be people clustered around a grave. And for a moment, Zhang feels this unbelievable sense of relief. Here we go, there's some people here. You know, they're visiting their relatives. They can help me. But before Zhang ran over there and asked for their help, he watched one of them sort of turn their bodies and they looked back at Zhang. And instantly Zhang's body was overcome with terror once again. Because this person was not a person. This was a faceless, dark figure, just like the one he had encountered near the pond. And there was this horrible sense that this thing was looking right at him. And so horrified, Zhang just turned and ran away. That night, Zhang found himself inexplicably back at that small pond. Didn't even know how he got there, but at this point, he wasn't questioning anything. because he didn't understand any of this. And as he was next to this pond, at some point, he had that heaviness come over him, and before long, he was on the ground, closing his eyes. However, this time, as he sort of slept or became unconscious, he entered into this sort of dream state where he became aware that there were whispers all around him. Somebody or something was trying to communicate with him, and at first he couldn't tell what it was. But then he realized it was like the earth was talking to him. It was like the rocks and the nearby water were literally speaking to him. And for some reason, this felt sort of comforting, even though again, he has no idea what to make of this. And then when Zhang woke up again, it was bright out, and all of a sudden Zhang was aware that the forest was alive again. There were sounds coming from everywhere, animals, insects, there was water sounds. It was like things were back to normal. And Zhang, he also had this incredible clear-headedness that he hadn't had for the past several days. It really was like things had gone back to normal. And so Zhang stood up, and he heard the sound of running water nearby, and he followed it to a stream. And so he decided he would just follow this stream right on out of the MacLehose Trail. Like this was going to be the way he would get out of here. But after walking for hours and hours along the stream, he still had not found his way out. The sun was now directly overhead, beaming down on him. He was so hot, he was tired, he was moving slower and slower. His optimism was beginning to fade. And then he looked up, and just up ahead, he saw something that destroyed any of the optimism he had left. Because right up ahead were 3 more shadow figures with their back to him. It was like they were blocking his way towards freedom. And so as Zhang tensed up and prepared to turn and run back deeper into this trail that he was trying to escape, one of these shadow figures turned, and they looked directly at Zhang. And when they did, everything changed. Because Zhang instantly realized this was no shadow figure. This was a real person. They had a face, and they were calling out to him saying, "Hey, do you need any help?" And Zhang was so relieved, so happy. He couldn't even say anything back. He just fell to his knees and wept tears of joy. He was finally saved. It would turn out Zhang's wife had called the police on that first night when Zhang didn't come home. And so the whole time Zhang was out in the woods over these several days, there was actually a massive search party out there looking for him. However, none of the searchers claimed to have seen or heard Zhang at any point, and Zhang did not see or hear any of the searchers. Those people at the end who finally rescued him were just random hikers that happened to see him. But somehow, despite the fact that Zhang really could not have gone very far from his car, I mean, he really didn't cover a huge distance on this trail when this whole experience began, despite that, the searchers never heard or saw Zhang at any point, and Zhang obviously never heard or saw any of them. So they're basically in the exact same area, looking for each other, but nobody sees each other. After being discovered by those 3 real people on MacLehose Trail, Zhang was taken to a hospital where he was examined, and it was determined there was nothing physically wrong with him other than he had not had much to eat or drink in several days. In fact, the official explanation for what happened to Zhang was just that he was really dehydrated. However, Zhang didn't buy that explanation. And when Zhang left the hospital and got back home, he immediately began digging into the history of the MacLehose Trail, and he would quickly discover that he was not the first person to have a totally wild, bizarre, borderline paranormal experience out on that trail. It would turn out the MacLehose Trail cuts across a geographic line called the Sai Kung Barrier. This is an area of the Sai Kung Peninsula that is generally considered to be a portal to other dimensions. And there have been enough people to have otherworldly experiences out on this trail that loosely match what Zhang claims to have seen and experienced, that they dubbed the area this trail is in as the Bermuda Triangle of South China. And adding even more intrigue to this area is the fact that several other very experienced hikers have gone missing along this trail, and they've had huge search parties sent out for them, but they were never found. Zhang would eventually share his story of what happened to him out on the trail in a 3,500-word essay that he posted on social media. He, and many others, believe that when he first fell and collapsed on the trail, that he actually fell through the Sai Kung Barrier and entered another dimension. That for those days that he was wandering around having no idea what was happening to him, that he wasn't really in this dimension anymore. He was somewhere else. Zhang believed the only reason he was able to escape this other dimension was because on his final night in this other place, he began to hear the sounds of the rocks and the water whispering to him. He said the only reason he was able to hear that was because he had sort of accepted his fate, that here he was in this totally strange world that he couldn't understand and didn't have any real expectation to escape from. And it was that sort of resignation that he allowed himself to feel that kind of put him in touch with this dimension, and he believes that's what ultimately allowed him to come back home. Despite those who doubt him, Zhang stands by his version of events. While his time on the trail did not cause him any physical harm, to this day he is still haunted by it.
On the evening of Friday, May 21st, 1993, a 29-year-old woman named Kem Wenger clapped her hands together in front of her with happiness in the basement of the Golden Congregational Church in rural Iowa. Her closest friends had gathered here to throw Kem and her fiancé, 32-year-old Kurt Simon, a combination wedding shower and goodbye party, and now they were presenting the couple with their gift. It was a money tree, planted in a little yellow coffee can with envelopes full of cash hanging off of it. Kem and Kurt both smiled and began making their way through the crowd to give everybody a big hug and to say thank you. Tonight was a big night for them. All their plans were finally falling into place. Tomorrow, they would pack all of Kurt's belongings into their car, and they would drive 230 miles south from the place where he had been living in Iowa to the city of Bloomington, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, where Kem already lived. And in Bloomington, they would begin their new life together as a soon-to-be married couple, raising Kem's 2 children from previous relationships. It had been a whirlwind 8 months since they had first met on actually a blind date. Kem had known almost immediately that Kurt really was something special, but it hadn't been easy for them to get to this point. They both had almost no money. Kurt was studying to be a Presbyterian minister and living in Iowa to finish seminary school. And Kem was a single mom living in Bloomington who had just recently quit her office job because her coworker was sexually harassing her. She'd taken on off-the-books work as a hairdresser and house cleaner, but she still had to rely on public assistance to make ends meet. The long-distance relationship itself was also just exhausting, with all the driving back and forth. And it didn't help that Kem had contentious relationships with the fathers of both of her kids. Her 1-year-old son's father, Dale Fosdick, was always late with his child support payments, and he still acted like he was entitled to walk right into Kem's house anytime he wanted. Kurt had actually recently confronted him about doing that and told him to stop, which Dale did not seem to appreciate. Her 7-year-old daughter's father, Todd Wenger, really wasn't much better. Todd fought with Kem all the time over their custody arrangement, and he and her other ex, Dale, were actually friends, which really annoyed Kem. But now, as somebody handed Kem a piece of cake in the church basement, all those problems seemed like they were about to get a whole lot smaller. Kurt was moving in, and Kem was about to get her whole life organized. Waiting for her at home in Bloomington, she had a whole collection of modern bride magazines so she could plan their wedding, and she and Kurt were actually talking about Kurt maybe adopting her son. And she knew Kurt could very quickly get a job in Bloomington as a pastoral counselor, and they could maybe save some money by only having to pay for one residence now. And this money tree they were getting was a sweet start. I mean, Kem knew that the members of the congregation were not wealthy people by any stretch. But, she found it very touching that they'd pooled their limited resources to give her and Kurt such a wonderful send-off. The only thing that could make this moment any better would be if Kem's mother, Cricket, was there. But unfortunately, Kem and Cricket were estranged. Kem wished she could be closer to her mother, but Cricket had a mean streak, and for some reason, she really hated Kurt. Kem finished her cake and then checked the time, and she realized, it was time to go, so she tapped Kurt on the shoulder as he was speaking to some friends. They had a lot left to pack tomorrow morning, and they had a long drive ahead of them. So Kem and Kurt made their goodbyes and then headed out of the church holding hands. The next day was Saturday, May 22nd, and Kem and Kurt spent the first part of the day packing and then the second part driving. And then finally, at 10:30 p.m. that night, they pulled their car into the driveway of Kem's 2-story house in Bloomington, the home they would now share together. Kem just sat for a second in the passenger seat while Kurt got out of the car and opened up the trunk. They had a lot of stuff to carry in, but Kem was just exhausted and frankly didn't feel like doing it quite yet. So she watched as Kurt went ahead and walked up the front stairs carrying a box and the money tree. He unlocked the door, he stepped inside, and then a minute later, he came back out empty-handed. And at that point, Kem sighed and decided she better get out and help too. Kurt was halfway back down the stairs as Kem grabbed her own box out of the trunk and walked her way into the house, into the foyer of her home. She put her box down and was about to go back outside and do another trip with Kurt when she paused. There was something she didn't recognize on the floor of the foyer that had not been there when she had left for Iowa. Kurt was outside, facing away from the house, when an intense wave of pressure hit him from behind. And nearly at the exact same time, this booming sound like some kind of explosion filled his ears. He stumbled forward almost uncontrollably and then whipped around and called out for Kem. But his ears were ringing now and he couldn't really tell if she had answered. There was smoke pouring out from the front door of their house, and instinctively he just ran into the house, into the foyer to go find Kem. When he got in there, there's all this smoke and chaos, there's shards of broken glass everywhere, and also he noticed all these little pieces of what looked like metal kind of all over the foyer. Kurt screamed Kem's name over and over, and he looked frantically all around through all the rubble, but it was impossible to see. It was like everything was destroyed in here. And so now, beginning to gasp from all the smoke, he started walking around the foyer, kind of ducking below the smoke as best as he could, and that's when he saw legs on the floor. Minutes later, Detective Larry Shepard of the Bloomington Police Department pulled up outside the two-story house in his cruiser, with his partner beside him and another squad car behind them. Shepard did not usually respond to 911 calls because he was a homicide detective, but he had happened to be in the area when dispatch requested officers go check out a report of potentially a shotgun blast on a residential street. However, the second he stepped out of his car and looked at this two-story house, Shepard knew this could not have been a shotgun blast. There was all this black smoke billowing out the front door of the house, and although Shepard couldn't see any fire, he could hear the fire alarm going off inside. And outside, the street was chaos. There were all these people who Shepard guessed must be neighbors shouting and running around, and there was debris everywhere. Broken glass and splintered pieces of wood and chunks of metal that had basically been blown out of the house out onto the street. In the driveway of this home, Shepard could see there was a man who had his hands on his head and he looked frantic, and he was yelling the name Kem over and over again as he looked towards the destroyed house. And it was at that point Shepard realized there must be someone or multiple people inside of the house. And he really couldn't wait for backup to go find them. So he and his partner shouted for everyone to stay back, and then they raced up the stairs into the smoke. Once Shepard was inside the front foyer, he could tell there was no active fire, just lots of smoke kind of hanging in the air, and he looked around and he saw there was a 6-inch hole on the wall right near the front door, and there was another hole right in the floor of the foyer. But even though he saw those things pretty quickly, his attention quickly snapped to the body of a woman who was on the ground, and it was immediately clear that there was nothing they could do for her. Literally half of her head was just missing. In his entire career, Shepard had never worked a murder case where the weapon was a bomb. But standing in this blackened, destroyed foyer over the charred body of this woman, Shepard felt sure that that is exactly what he was looking at right now. Around this point, the officers from the other squad car had now come up the stairs and into the house. But Shepard told them to get back, go back outside, because the scene was not safe to process yet. They needed the fire department here, and they needed the bomb squad, because there could be more explosives. Not long afterwards, Shepard and the other officers stood on the front lawn as members of the fire department and the state police bomb squad combed through the scene. By this point, Detective Shepard had learned a bit more about what had happened. The dead woman was Kem Wenger, and the man he had seen screaming in the driveway was Kem's fiancé, Kurt Simon. Neighbors said the pair had arrived around 10:30 p.m., and a couple of the neighbors had actually noticed them before the blast went off when they started unloading their car. These neighbors said that they saw Kurt be the first one to go inside the house, and when he did, he went in carrying a box that he had pulled from the back of the car. And then these neighbors said they saw Kurt come out again, empty-handed, but he went down to the back of the car again, and he appeared to put something in the trunk. And at the same time, Kem had grabbed a box from the car, and she went into the house by herself, and that's when the explosion happened. Shepard was troubled by these accounts. He thought it was suspicious that Kurt had been able to walk into the house without getting hurt, and then just seconds later, Kem goes in and her arrival seems to have triggered the explosion. And so naturally, he wondered if maybe that box Kurt was carrying that he went inside with, maybe that was the bomb, and he planted it. And then when he left, she goes in and it obviously goes off. And then also he wondered, what had Kurt put back into his car after he came out again? What did he put into the trunk? But even more suspicious than any of that was what a preliminary sweep of Kem's home had turned up in the basement. And that was wires, gunpowder, and fuses. Shepard did not need to be a bomb expert to know that these could be components of a bomb, and that whoever killed Kem must have built the bomb right there in her basement, which naturally made Kurt Simon the #1 suspect. So Shepard told a crime scene tech to process Kurt's vehicle and pay extra attention to the trunk. Then the detective walked over to Kurt himself. And Kurt was rocking back and forth, and he was crying, and he was still just saying Kem over and over and over again. Shepard asked Kurt if he could tell him, what had happened here. And Kurt looked at him with this vacant and shocked expression, and he told the detective that he didn't know what happened. He'd gone inside with a box, and he had just started back down the stairs when he felt the blast behind him. And at this, Shepard's eyes narrowed, because according to the neighbor's account, they said Kurt was actually at his trunk, putting something back into the car at the time of the explosion. But Kurt was now claiming that he had actually only just exited the house, basically was on the stairs as the blast happened. Now, this discrepancy could just be a result of confusion, or Kurt could be lying to cover up whatever he may or may not have done. But independent of whatever this was, Shepard just told Kurt that right now he was going down to the station for questioning. Several hours later, a little before dawn on Sunday, May 23, 1993, Detective Shepard walked out of the interrogation room in the Bloomington, Illinois police station, where he'd just spent more than an hour hammering Kurt Simon with questions about his murdered fiancée. And Kurt had been a pretty difficult interview. He had plenty of ideas about other people who might have killed Kem. He told Shepard that both the fathers of Kem's children, Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, fought with her all the time. And he said that Kem's estranged mom, Wilma Lewis, who everybody called Cricket, was, quote, every kind of evil. But Kurt had seemed to have no information to offer about what he had actually witnessed before the explosion. He had stuck to a story that he had not seen anything suspicious at all in the foyer, which Shepard found hard to believe. Kurt also had no explanation for why the bomb exploded on Kem and not on him, and he also denied knowing anything about the bomb-making materials that had been found in Kem's basement. Kurt also said he hadn't put anything back in his trunk around the time of the explosion, but he couldn't explain why the neighbors said he had. Shepard ultimately thought Kurt was either the most unobservant person alive, or he was lying. And on top of all that, Kurt had refused to take a lie detector test. However, Shepard still had to let him go home. The detective just didn't have anywhere near enough evidence to arrest Kurt, at least not yet. At this point, the bomb squad was actually still searching the house for any additional bombs, so the crime scene techs had not gotten in yet to begin to start looking for forensic evidence. They actually hadn't even been able to remove Kem's body yet. Shepard knew the day ahead was going to be very busy. Other members of his team had spent the entire night canvassing the neighborhood and notifying and questioning Kem's family members. And now Shepard was sure there was going to be quite a few interrogations for him to conduct. He'd already been awake for 24 hours by this point, but he knew there was not going to be any sleep soon. So he walked to the office coffee pot and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood there drinking it and thinking about how he was going to nail Kurt Simon for murder. Meanwhile, the bombing itself was making huge news all across Illinois. By about 9 a.m. on Sunday morning, so less than 12 hours after the explosion, there were all these reporters milling around the front entrance of the police station, and some were even going in and out of the lobby, trying to talk to people and get any information. And Detective Shepard knew this story was only going to get bigger, because the Illinois State Bomb Squad had just called in the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF, to help them process the scene. And all that meant there was going to be an enormous amount of pressure on Shepard, who was leading the investigation. And this pressure was especially stressful this morning because the case he'd thought he'd had against Kem's fiancé, Kurt Simon, was starting to fall apart. In all their interviews with Kem's friends, Everyone had said Kem and Kurt had a good relationship and were excited to start their life together. The crime scene unit had searched Kurt's car, where neighbors claimed they had seen him place something in the trunk right after the explosion or manipulate something back there, maybe a detonator. But the crime scene techs had found nothing suspicious at all back there. Shepard's partner had checked out Kurt's story that he had spent the entire week previous to the explosion in Iowa, where he lived, and he was moving here to Bloomington to live with Kem. And they had found out that that story was true. He really had been in Iowa. And so this made Shepard's theory that Kurt had assembled the bomb in Kem's basement a lot less likely, since Kem was home all week and Kurt wasn't there. Plus, Kem's babysitter had given police 2 additional pieces of information that really widened the suspect pool. First, she said that the spare key to Kem's house had recently gone missing. And the second thing was, because the spare key was gone, Kem had gotten locked out at some point and had to cut a hole in the screen in the back door to get inside. And so this meant that basically anybody could have gotten inside of Kem's house to build the bomb if they just went in through the back door, or if they, had the key, if they stole the key. So Shepard's suspect list effectively had gone from Kurt to all of Bloomington. Just before lunchtime, Shepard walked into the station's interrogation room where Kem's ex-husband, Todd Wenger, was sitting waiting for him. With Kem's fiancé, Kurt, looking less and less likely as a suspect, the detectives had set their sight on Kem's exes. Both Todd, who was the father of Kem's daughter, and Dale Fosdick, who was the father of Kem's son, not only had obvious motives, but they also knew Kem's schedule, because each of them had been watching one of her children over the weekend before she was killed. Shepard's partner had actually already spoken to Dale. Basically a couple of hours after the explosion, he had spoken to him, while Shepard himself had been busy questioning Kurt. And during that exchange, Dale had seemed shocked by Kem's death, and he'd made what seemed like a good faith effort to answer the detective's questions, although his son kept crying and interrupting them. Dale did admit to having some tension with Kem, but he also had an alibi. He'd been with family in the morning and doing yard work in full view of his neighbors in the afternoon and the evening. He'd given Shepard's partner names and phone numbers of potential witnesses that could have witnessed this, and a preliminary round of calls to those witnesses had suggested that Dale was telling the truth. But the detectives were conducting all their interviews with very little information about the crime itself, because they didn't really know how the bomb that killed Kem actually worked. They weren't sure if the killer had to be, right nearby to detonate it, or if maybe it had been remote operated so the killer could be farther away, or maybe the bomb was just set to some kind of timer. Scientists at the ATF were trying to reconstruct the bomb from all the shrapnel, but until they did that, Shepard and his partner would not know exactly when the killer would have been at Kem's house. And none of the neighbors had reported seeing anything unusual around the time of the explosion that would help them narrow it down. So now, as Detective Shepard sat down across the interrogation table from Kem's ex-husband Todd Wenger, he started with some general questions about his relationship with Kem. And Todd seemed a little nervous because he kept wringing his hands while he spoke. He said that he and Kem did fight about child support costs, and he said he had been very frustrated with her because he didn't feel like she was always fair during their divorce. But he insisted that that did not mean he wanted to hurt her. He said their problems were common for most divorced couples. Shepard did not put much stock in that assertion because in his experience, divorce or breakup plus money was a very good motive to hurt somebody. So he asked Todd where he'd been all day on the night of the blast. And at this question, Todd definitely appeared to relax, and he launched into a very detailed explanation of all his movements. He said he'd been with his daughter and his new girlfriend, and both of them would definitely vouch for him, along with several people who had seen them during the day. By the time Shepard sent Todd home, he really wasn't sure which of the exes, Todd or Dale, he thought was a better candidate for his killer. Both had clearly been fighting with Kem or had real tension with Kem, but both had alibi witnesses. So, Kem's fiancé Kurt might have had the opportunity to plant the bomb if it was set shortly before the explosion, but he had no clear motive. As for Todd and Dale, they seemed to have plenty of motive, but no real opportunity. And so Shepard decided his next move should be to talk again to Kem's family. Maybe they would be able to help him sort out his flawed suspect list. On Sunday evening, so almost 24 hours after the explosion, Detective Shepard knocked on the door of the home where Kim's sister, Joni, lived. Now, by this point, another officer had already been there to tell her and their mother, Cricket, about Kim's death, but Shepard wanted to hear from them himself. Now, Shepard had been told that Kim and her mother were estranged, but even though he went in with some idea that this interaction could be odd, Shepard was still really caught off guard by the way Cricket was acting. It was like way over the top. As Joni welcomed Shepard inside and offered him a seat on the couch, she was crying. Her reaction to the death of her sister seemed very genuine. But Cricket was not crying or showing any signs of being sad. Instead, she was just furious, and not about the murder, or about losing her child, or about the fact that police had not made an arrest yet. She was furious about her child's life insurance policy, which apparently Kim had not added her to as a beneficiary, which meant that Cricket was not going to be paid any money despite her child being killed. As Shepard seeing this, he thought about how Kurt had insisted in his interrogation that Cricket was a horrible person, that she was evil. Now, at the time, Shepard had not really taken that seriously because he figured Kurt was trying to throw suspicion off of himself, and lots of people don't like their mother-in-laws. But now he was reconsidering. He felt like he was witnessing someone who could be just as bad as they were described to be. And then, when Shepard actually asked Cricket about her relationship with her now deceased daughter, Cricket went off, but not about her relationship really with Kim, but more about Kurt and how Kurt had ruined Kim's life. She said Kurt was a terrible partner for Kim and that he had destroyed the best relationship she ever had, which Cricket said was with Dale Fosdick, the father of Kim's son. She also said that Kurt had destroyed her, Cricket's relationship with Kim too. She said that she and her daughter used to talk every day, but once Kurt was in the picture, she had been forbidden to call the house at all. Now, to Shepard, Cricket seemed completely scattered, bouncing from one subject to another and just mad about everything. But he started to wonder if what he was witnessing here was not just pure selfishness and being a terrible person, but instead could be some kind of very complicated grief or maybe even guilt, or grief and guilt combined. But one thing was definitely true, which was Cricket really seemed to hate Kurt as much as Kurt seemed to hate her. And Shepard just wasn't sure which one of them was in the right. But it was around this point in the conversation that Kim's sister, Joni, cut in, and she offered up a potential suspect idea of her own. She said that Kim had recently left a job where a colleague, a man named Phil Hartman, had sexually harassed her. Following this, Kim had actually gotten a settlement out of it, and apparently Phil had made threats afterwards, including a promise to get her for this. And so Joni said it was Phil who the police really should be investigating for this murder. When Shepard finally left the house, his head was spinning. He'd gone to Cricket and Joni, hoping for clarity, sorting out his 3 suspects. But he'd come away with less clarity and now 5 suspects. Kim's fiancé Kurt, her exes Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, her co-worker Phil Hartman, and frankly, Cricket herself. At this point, it was late on Sunday night, and Shepard had been awake since Saturday morning, and so he decided the best thing he could do now was just go home and get some sleep. That way, he could come back with a clear head on Monday morning and maybe make sense of it then. On the afternoon of Monday, May 24th, so almost 2 days after the bombing that killed Kim Wenger, Detective Larry Shepard walked through the front door of Kim's house, feeling cautiously optimistic. On the night the bomb went off, the police had to evacuate so the State Bomb Squad and the ATF could make sure there were no additional explosives. But finally, the night before, the scene had officially been cleared, which meant Shepard could now enter the house and actually look around for himself. Inside the house, he could see that the foyer was still in complete disarray, although Kim's body by this point had been removed and autopsied. There were also now all these little flags and markers all over the place, pointing out how she'd been positioned on the floor and where various bomb fragments and other evidence had been collected. And also now, because the feds had completed a preliminary assessment of the bomb, Shepard could actually imagine how the bombing went down. There was a 6-inch hole in the foyer floor, and Shepard now knew that that was where the bomb had been placed, right there on the ground, probably concealed in some kind of a small box or package. From the autopsy, which had shown distinct damage to Kim's right hand, Shepard knew that what likely happened was that she had spotted the package and picked it up with her right hand, which then triggered the explosion. And this was actually the single most important thing the feds had been able to determine, that the bomb was motion activated. This was huge because it meant the bomber did not have to be at or even near Kem's house to trigger the explosion manually, which meant they could have left this thing there any time during the weekend. This also explained why there were a bunch of wires and bomb-making materials found in the basement, because if the bomb had been built somewhere else and transported to Kem's house in, say, a car, the bomb could have exploded along the way. So what likely happened was that Kem's killer brought a partially finished bomb to Kem's house that would not detonate as they carried it, and then they put the final touches on it right on site once it was actually in position in the foyer. This also meant the bomber had to be pretty sophisticated, because building a bomb like this took technical skill, it took some intelligence and real attention to detail, because if you don't have those things, you can set off the bomb and kill yourself. And so, in Shepard's mind, this likely took Kem's mother, Cricket, right off the table. She just did not strike him as organized enough or really coherent enough to build this type of bomb. She just seemed way too scatterbrained. Kem's exes, Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, both worked with machines for a living, so they were definitely still in. And her fiancé Kurt was highly educated, so he was still in. Shepard wasn't sure about Phil Hartman, the co-worker who Kem had accused of sexually harassing her. He had reached Phil by phone that morning, and Phil had told him he was working in Louisiana at the time the bomb went off, hundreds of miles away. But Shepard knew just being physically far away from the bomb when it went off was not a perfect alibi, because it was motion activated. You could place it and then travel and be far away. But at the same time, Louisiana was really far away, and Phil really didn't seem to have any technical background that Shepard had found, so Phil was still in, but less so. As Shepard stood there in the blackened, destroyed foyer, looking at the partially burned pages of Modern Bride magazines that had been blown all over the room, he thought about the fact that whoever had done this had to have been very comfortable in Kem's house. They had gotten inside the house at some point, and then clearly spent time in the basement tinkering with the bomb. Then they came up and they're in the foyer setting the bomb up. I mean, that's someone who's pretty confident they're not going to get caught doing all this inside the house. That's serious boldness. And so Shepard was starting to feel pretty confident that whoever had done this was either family to Kem or as close to her as family. Shepard left Kem's house thinking about how he might search both Dale and Todd's places of work to see if any of the machinery they used shared parts with the bomb. But as he stepped off the final step onto the sidewalk, he heard a voice call out behind him, and he turned to see a Bloomington police officer jogging over towards him. The bombing had created real panic, not just in Bloomington, but across Illinois. People were now terrified that there was going to be a bomb that would show up on their front porch. They would see a package they didn't recognize, and they would call the police with fears that that could be an explosive. I mean, it was like this paranoia had swept the state. And so in response to that, specifically in Bloomington, the police had a much stronger presence out on the street. And Shepard had also asked officers to recanvass Kem's neighborhood to question the neighbors again, now that they knew more about the bomb itself. Specifically, that the bomb was motion activated, which meant the bomber did not need to be there basically right before it went off. They were in the house. They were building the bomb days before. They planted the bomb in advance of the bombing, so there was a bigger window of time that they were wondering who was at Kem's house, who was acting suspicious near Kem's house in the days leading up to the bombing. Those were the questions they had for the neighbors. And so this officer that was running over to Shepard, that's what they had been doing, recanvassing the neighborhood. And when he reached Shepard, he told him he'd found something. Shepard eagerly followed the officer over to one of Kem's neighbors' houses, and there he saw a little girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, standing nervously next to her father. And based on what this little girl would say, along with evidence collected by the Bloomington Police Department and the ATF, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Kem Wenger on May 22, 1993. At around 10:30 that morning, the killer pulled up in their car outside of Kem's house. They picked up a bag that was sitting on their passenger seat, which contained a partially completed pipe bomb and some tools. With this in hand, they got out of the car and they walked up to the front door and they pulled a key from their pocket. This was the same key they had stolen from under the doormat a few months earlier. They used the key to unlock the front door and they let themselves inside. The killer then walked down to the basement, where they took all the various items from the bag and placed them on the counter, and they got to work. The killer was not worried about getting caught. They knew this neighborhood very well, and everybody in this neighborhood knew them, and they would not find it suspicious at all to see them there. Plus, they knew they would have an alibi for the time period when the bomb actually would go off. Once the bomb was mostly assembled, the killer gathered up most of their things. They left behind some random supplies in the basement, but figured it didn't really matter since the explosion would take care of everything. Feeling very confident in their workmanship so far, the killer walked back upstairs and placed the nearly completed bomb on the floor in the foyer. And then, as they completed the final steps, they could feel sweat beating on their forehead, because if they did anything wrong, the bomb would go off. But the killer got it all done, and they stood up very slowly and carefully and walked back out through the front door. But before they could get in their car and drive away, they saw one of the neighborhood girls playing in the yard next door. And the girl looked at them and waved and said hello. And the killer, who felt like they belonged there and no one will remember me, they waved back. Well, the little girl remembered that interaction, and she would tell Detective Shepard who she saw leaving Kem's house. It was none other than Kem's ex-boyfriend and the father of her son, Dale Fosdick. Dale was very upset that Kem had broken up with him and was now seeing Kurt. He had also heard from Cricket, who he was still very close with, that Kurt had talked about adopting his own son, and this enraged him. He couldn't stand the idea that his own boy might grow up calling another man dad. So he used the electronic skills and the tools he'd acquired from his hobby of building model airplanes to build a pipe bomb. And so ultimately, Dale was caught because of his entitlement to feel like he could just stroll into Kem's house anytime he wanted. Because he did that all the time, despite her saying not to, he became a familiar face in the neighborhood. And that's why that little girl remembered him. After months of forensic work that tied Dale even more closely to the bomb, he was finally arrested and found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 61 years in prison. But he would only serve 14 of those years because in 2010, while still behind bars, Dale died of a sudden illness. On February 12, 1949, a man in his 30s named Leonardo Paez paced around a radio station in a city called Quito, which is the capital city of Ecuador. It was a Saturday night, and Leonardo and all the people around him were working very hard to get ready for an urgent broadcast. So Leonardo was the director of Radio Quito, which was a highly respected news station owned by a popular newspaper called El Comercio. Most people in Ecuador basically got all their news either from this news station or that newspaper, or both. And running a radio station with such a great reputation was really a source of pride for Leonardo, who had grown up in Quito. So he took his job very seriously, which was why tonight was such a big deal for him. He was about to deliver a potentially life-changing broadcast to the entire city. And just thinking about the gravity of this moment was making him feel sick and sweaty. In the room with Leonardo was a team of producers and sound technicians, as well as one of the station's top news anchors. Most of the last-minute work they were all doing involved organizing stacks of paper that contained instructions about what to say and what to do during this pivotal broadcast. That's what the anchor was double-checking right now. He was the one who had written the broadcast script, and he would be the one actually reading it on the air. Leonardo looked anxiously over at the clock on the wall. It was already a few minutes after 9 p.m., and they didn't have a lot of time left. But even though Leonardo desperately wanted to get this broadcast started as soon as possible, he knew he had to give his anchor the space and time to make sure they were 100% ready before they actually went on the air, because they really only had one chance to do this right. So instead of telling the anchor to come on, hurry it up, Leonardo instead bit his lip and just paced around the station, trying to distract himself by listening to the program that was currently being broadcast over the radio station's airwaves. It was a live musical performance from a duo of singers named Benitez and Valencia. These two combined were really famous, sort of like the Taylor Swift of 1940s Ecuador. And so when people in Quito knew these particular singers were performing on the radio, basically everybody stopped what they were doing and tuned in to listen. So in Quito in the 1940s, nobody had TV. And so radios were like the ultimate form of not just how to get your news, but also of entertainment. It's really where everybody turned. But radios were also very expensive and were sort of a luxury item. So not everybody had one. The people who did have radios would often bring theirs outside to the street so that other people could also hear the programs and the music. And Leonardo knew that all of this meant that at this very moment, all across the city, most of Quito's 250,000 residents were gathered around a radio. And he needed to get his broadcast on the air while he still had everybody's attention. He turned and saw the anchor finally lean back in his chair, indicating he was ready, and so Leonardo knew it was time to go live. Leonardo turned and nodded to his technicians, who were all sitting at a table covered in broadcasting equipment, and one of them, after seeing Leonardo's cue, leaned forward to adjust several knobs and then hit a button on the control panel. And the instant he did this, the voices of the singing duo cut off, and a large red sign that said "On Air" lit up on the wall right above the table. Basically, they were going to cut off the performance to do this broadcast and catch everybody in Quito off guard. And then the anchor leaned into their microphone and, in a very urgent voice, said that they were interrupting this musical program because there was an alarming event happening that everybody in Quito had to hear about. Then he explained the reason for this broadcast. Ecuador was being invaded. About half a mile away from the radio station, 17-year-old Jose Antonio stood outside a restaurant with some of his friends. Jose and his friends and all the diners, plus a bunch of people out on the sidewalk, had been gathered around the restaurant owner's radio, listening to Benitez and Valencia sing, when suddenly the music had cut out and the anchor had come on to say that their country was under attack. And so as Jose and this group is sort of caught off guard and listening to this sudden announcement, the announcer got really emphatic and said, "Listen, the city of Latacunga has been destroyed." And at that, Jose's mouth fell open and he felt this jolt of fear in his chest. Latacunga was only about 60 miles south of Quito. So Jose, along with everybody else around him, instinctively leaned into the radio so they could hear more about what was happening and why. But when they all did that, the broadcast suddenly stopped just as abruptly as it had come on, and the music program came back on. But the street got really quiet as Jose and the crowd just kind of stood there, waiting for something to happen. I mean, really nobody knew how to react to this. A few people began looking up at the sky, thinking maybe warplanes might be flying overhead, and actually Jose began doing that too, wondering if, that's the next step. But there were no planes and there were no signs of anything that would indicate that war was happening nearby or, whatever destroyed Latacunga was approaching Quito. All Jose could hear was the echo of other radios around the city, now back to playing this musical program. But as the seconds ticked by and the crowd gradually began talking again and kind of going back to normal, some people began making jokes and suggesting that this broadcast was literally a joke, that was meant to be a prank. Others just kind of brushed the whole thing off and just went about their evening as if it had never even happened. However, Jose did notice that some of the people at the tables outside the restaurant where he was were still just kind of staring at the radio and shifting around like they were restless or uncomfortable, like clearly that broadcast had struck a nerve. Jose also kept fidgeting around and trading worried looks with his friends and the other people around him because he wasn't so sure this was a joke. And the reason he wasn't sure was because a sudden invasion of their country had actually happened before. 7 years earlier, in 1941, when Jose was just a kid, the much larger country of Peru had invaded Ecuador after an argument over land along a shared border. Instead of settling the argument diplomatically, the Peruvian army stormed into the disputed territory in Ecuador and conquered it pretty easily. And the fighting had only lasted for maybe about a month before Ecuador accepted that they had lost and retreated, giving up the land. But even though the fighting back then had never actually reached Quito, it had been a terrifying experience for residents of Quito because it made them realize they were not able to defend themselves against a foreign invader. But just then, as Jose and the others are sitting outside the restaurant, kind of grappling with what could be going on here. How real is this? Is this a prank? Just then, the music that had come back on again on the radio cut out, and once again, the broadcaster's voice came on, and they said they had an update. The enemy had landed their aircraft right on the outskirts of Quito, in a northern area called Cotocollao, which was only 8 miles from the center of Quito. And suddenly, Jose and the others realized that if the enemy had destroyed Latacunga in the south and now landed in Cotocollao in the north, then the city of Quito was effectively surrounded. But before Jose could even process this thought, another man's voice came on the radio. And unlike the first voice, which was emphatic but, basically calm, this guy was absolutely panicked. He said he was the chief of Quito's newspaper, and then he basically screamed, "The airbase has been taken over by the enemy and destroyed. They're exterminating everything and everyone." He continued to yell that the enemy was using poisonous gas and they were using fire and they were literally killing people and destroying homes and buildings. And then he issued a simple and terrifying warning. They're coming. Jose felt himself let out this yelp that he couldn't even control. He was so suddenly terrified. But he didn't even hear it because all around him, everybody else seemed to react basically the same way all at once, and the streets erupted in screaming and praying and just absolute chaos. Some people began pointing up to the sky, yelling that they could see the enemy. More and more people suddenly began flooding out onto the streets, crowding around the radios, trying to hear more information. They're all terrified and they don't know what's going on. Jose wanted to begin to tell these new people who were coming outside sort of what he and others had heard so far, but everybody out on the street was sort of talking over each other. It was just complete madness. And then literally on the radio, there's all these different voices coming over because clearly the news station is panicked and they can't even get a cohesive message out over this broadcast. However, despite this madness, the one word that kept coming through on the radio that everybody heard was "Go hide. Hide from the enemy. Hide." And Jose and some other people around him were thinking about doing just that when finally a new voice took over the broadcast. And this man was louder and more authoritative than the others, and it sort of immediately projected calm, not just clearly calm on the other end on the broadcast side, but it sort of quelled the crowd for a second. This person sounded like an authority figure, and this person introduced himself as the mayor of Quito. And he said that yes, there are cities around Quito that are currently under attack, but he said he had clear direction that he wanted everybody in Quito to follow. But despite this instruction really being the first kind of clear next steps for people to follow, it didn't make Jose feel any better about this, because the mayor told the people of Quito that the women and children, they had to flee, go hide, go away, go find somewhere safe. But the men had to stay and fight. Jose felt this rush of adrenaline because he's thinking, am I old enough to be considered, one of the men? Will I be expected to fight, or are they going to tell me to go flee with the women and kids? Like, he didn't really know, but he had this calming thought. He's like, you know what? We're at war, and I am going to fight. So he signaled to his friends, sort of saying, all right, let's go, let's get ready here. And the group came together and they left the restaurant. And at that exact same second, a car came flying past on the street, narrowly missing Jose and his friends. And Jose saw it screech around the corner and out of sight before he heard this loud bang and the crunch of metal against stone. Immediately, some men ran after this car because clearly it had gotten into an accident and they need to go if they need help. But other people started running in the opposite direction. And so for Jose and his friends, it's like, what do? Do we go help with the car crash, or do we go, head to the front lines or something? At the same time, women were running by, clutching children, and Jose saw a pregnant woman stumble on past, grimacing as she held her stomach. Screams were echoing from all around him, along with the rapid pounding of boots on cobblestones as people basically ran in every direction. Jose was still trying to figure out which way he should go and what he and his friends should actually do here when he heard a news speaker's voice come on the radio, who announced himself as the Minister of Government, which was basically like the person who controls the security of the entire country of Ecuador. And the Minister of Government said to forget about what the mayor had told them about fighting the enemy, because Ecuador's weapons were literally not powerful enough. There was nothing that anyone in Ecuador could do. This is what the minister said. He basically said, we're going to lose. Just then, another new voice came on the radio. It was this very fast-talking man who said he was actually reporting live on the ground in Quito. Then he screamed out over the broadcast for everyone to run. And then his feed abruptly cut out. And then the original announcer came back on, and his voice shook as he said that reporter who had just said for everybody to run had just been killed. It was 9:21 p.m. 21 minutes had elapsed since this broadcast first went over the air, announcing this invasion of Ecuador. And in that time, it was like the country had spiraled into absolute madness. Now, remember, at this point, Jose is gathered with his friends. He's sort of begun to leave the restaurant, but so many things have happened all around him that he and his friends are just kind of standing there near the restaurant, not really sure what to do. And as they're standing there, Jose noticed that all these people who previously had just remained seated or remained near radios, it was like everybody all at once just got up and began running in different directions, running to the churches, running to their homes. It was like the entire country truly was just in full-blown panic mode. Jose also began to notice families come running out of their homes, dragging suitcases and belongings with them, getting ready to, evacuate hopefully, but where could they even go? They're surrounded. And just then, Jose heard the sound of glass shattering, and he saw a few people over at the restaurant's bar taking liquor from the shelves and pouring themselves drinks before tossing the bottles on the floor. Jose looked and realized his friends had already left him, so he's just standing here all alone. And he knew by this point he can't just keep standing here thinking about what he's going to do. He needs to do something. He needs to act. But just then, the radio crackled back to life, and once again there was a voice calling out one final update. But it was so crazy all around him, Jose couldn't understand what this final update actually was. He just didn't hear it. However, Jose could clearly see other people around him had heard this final update, and they were obviously reacting to it because they stopped. Everybody stopped running around. They put down their suitcases, and everyone just kind of stood there. And then people began going for their guns and knives and torches. And then, once this huge, now armed crowd came together, they began to move as one, all in the direction of the city center. In the city center, in the Radio Quito station, Leonardo watched as the anchor delivered that final update, the one that Jose had not heard but others had and clearly reacted to. A minute later, Leonardo heard glass shattering somewhere one floor below him, along with a loud crackling sound. Then he smelled smoke, and he noticed the air in front of him inside the studio was getting hazy. And then from outside the building, he heard somebody yelling, "Fire!" Behind Leonardo, the anchor grabbed the microphone and pleaded on air to anybody who was listening that the radio station was in trouble and to please come help. But there really was no one left to help them. They were on their own. And when Leonardo and his team realized this, they knew they had to get out of this station by themselves. And so they ran together down the stairs to the exit. But before they even got to the bottom of the steps, the smoke from the fire became so thick they couldn't even breathe. Leonardo realized that the whole first floor must be engulfed in flames. And so the only way out was actually to go up, not down. So Leonardo led the group back up the way they came, running back through the second floor office building, the studio space where they had recorded the broadcast, and headed up the stairs to the very top floor. And by the time Leonardo got to the top floor, he could hear screams coming from somewhere below him, and they sounded painful and horrible. He hoped his coworkers had been able to follow him up here, but by this point there was so much smoke in the building, he really couldn't see, so he didn't know who was here with him and who had been left behind. And also the roar of the fire was getting louder by the minute, and it was so hot that sweat poured from Leonardo's face and it stung his eyes. And so Leonardo instinctively ran away from the smoke towards the windows. And because they're on the top floor, 3 floors up, looking out, he had a good view of the ground below. And he saw these huge crowds of people on the street. Most of them were holding torches and seemed to be running around in random patterns while big military tanks rolled in behind them, along with this hazy mist from some kind of gas kind of flowing across the entire crowd. Just then, Leonardo felt the floor under his feet begin to shake. And he frantically began to think, how am I going to get out of here? I need to escape. And that's when he saw the roof next door. So the radio station sat next door to a school, which was at this point not yet on fire. Now, the school building was not connected to the radio station, But it was close enough that Leonardo realized that he might be able to open up a window that he's standing right near, get a running start, and literally jump out the window and land on the school roof. Now, obviously, if he undershot this jump, he would fall to the street below and die. But the alternative was stay here and be burned alive. So Leonardo just opened up the window, he backed up, took a deep breath, got a running start, and jumped out the window. He flew into the air, arms flailing as he willed himself to land on the school roof, and after a millisecond in the air, he comes crashing down, slams onto the school building. He had made it. It was painful, but he had escaped. But Leonardo didn't have time to waste here, nor did he really have time to wait to see if others would also make this jump. I mean, he really felt like he's sort of on his own here. And so up he got, and despite the pain from impacting the roof, he was basically okay. And he walked across the school building until he went to the next roof. Basically, the next building butted up against the school building. So he climbs onto that roof, and he walks across that roof until he reaches the next building. Again, these buildings are all connected, so there's no more jumping from, one building to the next, but he is going roof to roof, basically high up above the streets of Quito. And down below, he sees, all this madness with the tanks and all these people with torches. He doesn't really know what's going on here. And eventually, he reaches a roof, as he makes his way, that a family was sitting on. And the family, they were looking out at the city, where the sky was still glowing from the light of the fire Leonardo had just escaped from. And when they saw Leonardo, they told him they had actually been down on the streets in that crowd. But when it became too dangerous, they had come up here to escape. And they asked Leonardo, had he done the same thing? Is that why he was here? Leonardo said no. And then he told them who he was and how he actually arrived here and why, and then he asked them for help. And for a second, the family just stared at him in shock. But then they began to talk to each other, and from what Leonardo could hear, and also based on facial expressions, the family seemed mad. But finally, the father looked at Leonardo and said yes, they would help him. However, there was a condition. He told Leonardo that under no circumstances could he, Leonardo, go down on the street with that crowd. The father said Leonardo would have to hide out in this family's house because, the father explained, that everybody in the city, including all those people down there, wanted Leonardo's head. It would turn out Leonardo's broadcast had actually been wildly successful. It had done exactly what he hoped it would do. It grabbed the attention of basically everybody in Quito. The whole city stopped in its tracks to listen to what the broadcast had to say. However, there was one very important fact that Leonardo had decided not to mention in this broadcast until the very end, when in many ways it was already too late. This fact was the final update, the one Jose had not been able to hear, but that had caused everybody on the street who had heard it to stop running around, stop screaming, and just get their guns, knives, and torches and head towards the center of town. The fact that was held off until the very end was this whole broadcast was a farce. The invasion was not real. It was an act, a prank, a joke. The broadcast was like this play. It was an adaptation of a fiction novel called War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which is about an alien invasion. And so what Leonardo did is he orchestrated this broadcast to sound and feel like a real breaking news broadcast about an alien invasion. The exact same thing had actually been done in the United States a few years earlier in 1938. But in the American version, the listeners had been warned at the beginning of the broadcast that it was not real. And it still caused mass panic, even though they had been warned. And so, during Leonardo's broadcast, when he finally revealed the truth at the very end, the listeners were not, soothed. They were not like, oh boy, what a great prank. They were furious. So furious, in fact, that they went to the radio station in the city center where Leonardo and his broadcast crew were, and they lit it on fire. And so between the radio station fire and also between all the people who took their own lives preemptively, believing aliens were going to be here any minute to kill them, torture them, abduct them, the death toll from this night, from this farce, was between 6 and 20 people. And a whole lot more people were also injured in the chaos. As for 17-year-old Jose Antonio, he would survive, And later in life, he would actually give a tell-all interview about his experience during the so-called alien invasion. As for Leonardo, he didn't face any criminal charges, no jail time, nothing. But this whole incident really destroyed his credibility, and it made people not trust him in Ecuador. So it was basically impossible to get work. And so eventually he had to move to Venezuela. And then as for Radio Quito, the at one point very influential, very important news broadcast, they wouldn't make another broadcast for 2 whole years after this incident. On the evening of Sunday, January 26, 1851, a 23-year-old man named Bailey Staples hurried up the walkway of a home in Fall River, Massachusetts. It was so cold that Bailey's could see his breath, but despite the weather, he could not stop smiling. And that was because he was about to do something that he loved to do that made him a lot of money, and it was actually the 3rd time that day that he was even doing it. I mean, this was awesome. Bailey's was a psychic medium, and he was about to perform a seance. So at this point in America, in 1851, there was this phenomenon going on called the spiritualist movement. Basically, huge numbers of people began to believe that the living and the dead could actually communicate with each other through mediums like Bailey's. And at this time, there was a very specific way that mediums like Bailey's conducted their seances. They would sit at a round table along with all their guests that were going to participate, and they would summon spirits. And what would happen is the participants in these seances could literally tell when it was that the spirit actually made contact with the medium. Because the round table they were all sitting at would shake or move, sometimes the table would thump so violently that one of the legs of the table would break off. And a broken table at a seance was considered a huge success. So seances were a craze all over the country, and many people did genuinely believe that, people like Bailey's, mediums, could talk to ghosts in these seances. But there were lots of people also who didn't believe any of it, thought it was completely made up, but they would still hire people like Bailey's to have these seances at parties and other functions as sort of a form of entertainment, kind of like how you might hire a band or a magician. And in Fall River, Massachusetts, there really was a big appetite for these seances, both because people believed they were true and lots of people who thought they were fake. And it's in part because there were lots of homes in Fall River, Massachusetts at the time that sort of had some history about being haunted, and so there was sort of groundwork laid for both believers and non-believers to contract people like Bailey's. Now, to be clear, Bailey's whole seance act was a blatant fake. In fact, many of the people who hired Bailey's knew in advance that it was all an act, that Bailey's really was more of a performer than a psychic medium. But Bailey's was really good at faking it, and so he had become kind of like the go-to medium, certainly in Fall River, which meant for him to maintain this flow of business, he really had to put full energy into every performance to keep getting people to call on him. So on this day, as Bailey's is sitting there getting ready to start his 3rd seance of the day, he was tired. I mean, it's pretty exhausting to do these performances, but he knew he just had to get that second wind and just push through and do as good of a job as he possibly could. And so as the homeowner of this 3rd seance opened up the door and let him inside, Bailey's was sure this was going to be at least as good, if not better, than the other performances of the day. Moments later, the homeowner, John Gardner, led Bailey's into the living room where several other guests were already gathered. Bailey's immediately snapped into character. He swooshed his cape as he walked in, and he waved his hand around the room to command their attention. And when everyone turned to look at him, he said, "I have broken 2 tables today, and now I've come to break yours." The guests all cheered and clapped, and Bailey's could tell they were going to be a very enthusiastic audience, which always made these seances much more fun. So into the parlor they all went, and they all took a seat around this big circular table in the middle of the room. And then Bailey's dimmed the lights and walked around the table giving his instructions. He then told them to all hover their hands over the table with their palms down and their fingers spread, and that each of them would have to touch the hands of the person sitting next to them. He told them that once they were all touching, it would create a circuit that was more inviting to the spirits. And so once all of his guests got into position with their hands, Bailey's took his seat and did the same thing with his own hands, creating a full circuit all the way around the table. And at that point, everybody was ready. And so he nodded, and in a commanding voice, he said that now he was going to speak to the spirits. And if the spirits in the room felt like answering, they would move this table. The room got deadly quiet as everyone waited to see what Bailey's would do. But Bailey's just let the tension grow, because he knew that the longer he waited, the more anticipation would build. This was actually Bailey's favorite part of the performance, and he could feel his own heart begin to race. I mean, this really was exciting. But then finally, he broke the silence and called out to the spirits in the room and demanded that if there were a ghost here, to make itself known. And at this, everyone immediately began to look around excitedly, which created the quick distraction that Bailey's actually needed to perform his first trick. So mediums used a few different tools to help them fake communication from these ghosts, and one of those tools were these special hooks that they actually attached to their wrists, and they hid them under their sleeves. And then when they put their hands palm down, hovering over the table like they told everybody else to do, those hooks would actually go below the table and grip on, so the medium could, without looking like they're actually touching the table, literally lift the table up and rattle it around, again, without appearing to actually touch it. Now, it actually took a lot of strength to do this. I mean, imagine moving a huge table around just like with your arms kind of hovering over the table. But Bailey's was getting really good at it. And so as his guests were all looking around, looking out for ghosts, Bailey's masterfully hooked his hooks right under the table and began moving his wrists around, which caused the table to thump. And as soon as this happened, a woman on the other side of the table screamed, and the other guests began laughing and getting really excited. But Bailey's was only just getting started. He called out to the spirit again, much more forcefully this time. And as he did, he literally made the table rise off the floor as all the guests gasped. One man asked how Bailey's was even doing this. I mean, he knew this was fake, but how are you lifting the table up? Because his hands are over the table, remember. It's just these secret hooks underneath. But Bailey's just kind of ignored the man and smiled. And then he said to the spirit that if you're willing to communicate with us, rap on this table one time. And then Bailey's used the hook, underneath the table to make a knocking sound. And as he did this, the woman who had first screamed on the other side of the table, she jumped. She was so scared. And it actually caused Bailey's to have this surge of adrenaline, like he was really doing a good job. And so Bailey's actually kind of leaned into this and rattled the table a bit more for dramatic effect. And in doing this, Bailey's was really exerting himself. He's trying not to give off the vibe that he's moving this table around, but he really is. And so he's sweating bullets, and he's also yelling out to the spirit, demanding them to come forward and talk to us. But then, as Bailey's is doing this big act here that he in no way suspects is going to actually call spirits into the room, he suddenly felt the room turn icy cold. And he had this weird tingling sensation flowing through him. He blinked, and then his vision got hazy. This had never happened to him during any of his seances. And clearly it was having an effect on him because he no longer was trying to communicate with the dead. He was just kind of standing there, very uneasy, like the seance was actually doing something, that there really might be spirits in the room. Now, Bailey's can tell he's getting stared at, and he doesn't want to destroy his business here. He needs to maintain the act. He can't just spook himself out and stop the seance. But at the same time, he couldn't break out of this weird feeling he had. The room felt so cold. Something was off here. And then he tried to move, and it was like he couldn't. He was frozen. Now, at the same time Bailey's is experiencing this, across the table, the homeowner and host, John Gardner, is just sitting there staring at Bailey's, trying to figure out what's actually happening here. And from his perspective, he watched as Bailey's went from sort of standing there awkwardly, unable to move, it looked like, to then sitting down in his chair and sort of lurching back in this awkward position. And then Bailey's eyes began darting all over the room, and also his breathing got really ragged and heavy. And John couldn't help but feel like it looks like Bailey's is possessed for real. And then Bailey's began to speak, and his voice sort of cracked as he did, and he began mumbling something that John and the others couldn't understand. John, he really couldn't help it. He felt sort of spooked by this. This was really convincing. John actually wanted to applaud. Bailey's acting was so good here. But he also didn't want to destroy the act and sort of break his character. Like Bailey's, John and most of his guests did not believe seances were real at all. But, Bailey's performance was really turning out to be way better than any of them had expected. But just then, Bailey's shot up out of his chair, and the whole table thumped again and shook, and then Bailey's let out this almost ghostly sounding moan, and then one of John's guests asked if the ghost was speaking through Bailey's. But instead of answering, Bailey's eyes rolled all the way back in his head, so only the whites were visible. John and the others were transfixed. This was just incredible, really kind of scary stuff here. But then Bailey's let out another moan and then fell backwards hard onto the ground. And for a second, there was just confused silence. Because if this is an act, that was a violent fall. This looks really legitimate. How is Bailey's able to do this over and over again? This seems real. And it was in that moment of realizing that something is off here that some of the guests began to scream and they began to run out of the room. A few minutes later, a local physician named Dr. Hopper ran into the parlor of John Gardner's home. He'd been summoned by one of the guests who had panicked and actually ran out and gotten him. But that guest had been rambling about a ghost and a possession, so Dr. Hopper really wasn't sure what kind of problem he was actually responding to. But now he could see there was a group of people dressed for a party gathered around what appeared to be a seance table, pointing to the floor, where there was this young man lying in a crumpled heap. Dr. Harper went to the young man and reached out and felt the man's neck, but there was no pulse. And so the doctor turned and looked at the group and said, "He's dead." And before the group could really even react, the doctor said, "Now hold on. Someone needs to slowly and clearly explain what happened here." John Gardner stepped forward and now in a very shaking voice explained that this young man was a medium whose name was Bailey Staples. And he had been doing a seance and he had demanded a ghost talk to the group. And then a moment later, he was thrashing around, apparently possessed by this ghost, and then he fell to the ground, dead. John said they had all thought this seance was a fake. When they hired Bailey's, they literally thought this was just going to be a performance, nothing real. But now, they didn't know what to think. This looked very real. Dr. Hopper shook his head, not really sure what to make of this explanation. He certainly did not believe in ghosts, but after a quick examination of Bailey's, he really couldn't see any obvious cause for the medium's death. So Dr. Hopper got to his feet and told the dinner guests that, whatever killed Bailey Staples was not a ghost, but he didn't know what it was yet. However, he would get to the bottom of it. However, by the next morning, news of Bailey's death had spread all over Fall River and beyond, and it made the immediate autopsy that Dr. Hopper wanted to do to figure out what happened to him basically impossible. Now, the reason it was impossible is because some people were claiming that this was a ghost that possessed Bailey's, but it didn't actually kill him. The ghost must have put Bailey's into a trance where he appears dead, but is not actually dead. But if Dr. Hopper performs the autopsy on him, the autopsy will kill Bailey's, so you can't do that. And so pretty quickly, you have all these people that are showing up at Dr. Hopper's clinic and the local police station demanding authorities give them Bailey's body to prevent the doctor from killing him by doing an autopsy on him. And so it's this whole scene. And at the same time, keep in mind, the country as a whole has been taken with seances. That was already something that was sort of happening everywhere. But this story, which sort of legitimized the idea that ghosts could be real and ghosts can also be dangerous given what happened to Bailey's, this story is spreading like wildfire all over the country. And so at a time where people in America were already big on seances, this pretty much dumped gasoline on that. And seances became even more popular, but now because they felt real, not because they were entertainment. On January 28th, so 2 days after Bailey's was pronounced dead, Dr. Hopper stood in the basement of the local morgue holding a scalpel. He had finally gotten the approval to go ahead and conduct his autopsy, but he knew that a lot of people were not happy about it. And now he was looking down at Bailey's body, realizing that, to his own surprise, he was sort of nervous about this. Like the idea that, what if this guy's actually still alive and I'm about to kill him with this autopsy? Now, logically, the doctor did not think Bailey's was in a trance, but it was unsettling how physically healthy Bailey's body looked. He was young and strong with no history of illness, and there wasn't a mark on his body anywhere to explain why he was dead. The only blemishes on his skin were these slight bruises around his wrists, which Dr. Hopper understood were from the special hooks he had been wearing when he died to lift up the table. But Dr. Hopper shook off the nerves and moved his scalpel towards the skin of Bailey's chest and made his first incision, opening up the chest cavity. And that was when Dr. Hopper saw it. It would turn out, on the day Bailey Staples died, he was at his absolute performative peak as he lifted John Gardner's table up off the ground and made the seance guests scream and laugh. But what Bailey's didn't know, and what Dr. Hopper found when he performed the autopsy, was that Bailey's had a pre-existing heart condition, and his passionate performance, coupled with the physical exertion it took to lift up that heavy parlor table with just his wrists, and the fact that Bailey's had also already given 2 other similar performances that day, caused his weak heart to swell and develop an aneurysm which ruptured and caused fatal internal bleeding. Bailey Staples had basically put on the absolute best seance performance of his life. It was so good, in fact, that it killed him, and also accidentally convinced an entire house full of dinner guests and many people all across the country that ghosts were real.
17th, 1977, a 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore walked towards an abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. Gary was surrounded on all sides by guards because they were afraid that Gary might try to run and not go inside of this factory. But Gary was not about to run. He'd been waiting for months for this, and he was ready. So Gary, along with the guards at his sides, made their way towards the factory, and then without any hesitation, Gary stepped inside. And what he saw was this big, cavernous, open space with no equipment in it, nothing. It was just basically this massive empty space and one chair pushed up against the far back wall. Gary knew he was supposed to sit in that chair. So without even being told, he just began walking across the floor towards it. And then when he reached the chair, he sat down. And once Gary was sitting, the guards that had walked him in began strapping his wrists and his ankles to this chair so he couldn't move. And as they did this, Gary didn't put up a fight. He just sat there staring straight across to the other side of this factory. And on the far side of this factory was one other thing inside of the space. It was like this big curtain, like somebody had wheeled out like this massive curtain that was protecting something on the other side. And as he was staring at this curtain that was sort of perpendicular to him, he saw there were 5 evenly spaced cutouts across the curtain. And even though Gary couldn't actually see anything in any of these cutouts, he knew what was behind them. He knew that at each station, there was a police officer armed with a rifle. They were the firing squad that Gary himself had requested. So Gary was a convicted murderer, and he had been sentenced to death just a few months earlier. His death sentence had gotten a lot of media coverage, and immediately after the sentencing, his mother, along with the American Civil Liberties Union, had lobbied to try to change the sentence and make it a life sentence instead. But while Gary appreciated their efforts, he actually did not want that. He did not want, to spend the rest of his life in prison. That was the only alternative to the death sentence, is life without parole. And that sounded horrible. And so instead, he had basically pushed to go forward with his execution, and he was very specific about how he wanted to die. He wanted to die by firing squad, and that had been granted to him. And so after the guards had finished strapping Gary into the chair, they backed off, and then the chaplain came over and read Gary his last rites. And then after that, he asked Gary if he had anything else he wanted to say. And Gary looked up at the chaplain and just said, "Let's do it." And so the chaplain backed off, signaled to the firing squad that Gary was ready, and then once everything was in place, rifles poked through the 5 holes in the curtain, and they fired. Shortly after, Gary was dead. 10 years after Gary's execution in 1987, a young marketing executive named Dan Wyden was having a meeting with his colleagues at his company's headquarters in Portland, Oregon. So Dan actually owned this marketing agency, and his company had recently signed this new client. It was a small business with a lot of promise who was hopefully looking to expand, and they were leaning on Dan and his team to help them do that. And while Dan certainly believed that this company had the chance to be huge, he just felt like they lacked something. They needed a strong marketing campaign to really get them off the ground and sort of begin to make them a household name. And so this meeting that Dan was having right now with his colleagues was their attempts at coming up with, what can we do? What kind of campaign can we run for this company? And so for hours, they sat there pitching different ideas, different concepts of how we can elevate this brand.
But it was like, even though a lot of ideas seemed promising, nothing really felt right. Everything just sort of felt like, maybe that would help. There was no slam dunk idea, at least not yet. And so as Dan is beginning to get frustrated, realizing he really doesn't have any great ideas yet, he suddenly has this epiphany. Now, Dan does not understand why he had this epiphany. He had not been thinking about this information until it just popped into his head. Instead, this idea really just kind of suddenly came to him. As he's sitting there with his colleagues, feeling frustrated, not knowing what to do, he just randomly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore 10 years earlier, death by firing squad. It was all over the news. And Dan, like his colleagues, had certainly kept up with that story. It was a big deal at the time. And as Dan is sitting there just thinking about that execution, he remembered a very particular detail about the execution that for whatever reason just felt like, oh my goodness, we can use that to market this brand. Dan would take a well-known detail from the execution of Gary Gilmore, he would tweak it slightly, and he would use it to fuel this advertising campaign for the small business. And it would work amazingly. In fact, this campaign was so successful, it literally doubled this company's business practically overnight. And this campaign, it featured a slogan that has since become arguably one of, if not the most famous slogans for any business in the entire world. The slogan that Dan created as part of this very famous campaign was based directly on Gary Gilmore's final words: "Just do it." Dan's client, that small business, was Nike. Last year, we launched a brand new podcast here at Mrballen Studios called Redacted: Declassified Mysteries with Luke LaManna. And so far, you guys have loved it. And in case you haven't heard, we also launched a YouTube channel for Redacted, where you can not only listen to these episodes, but also watch the beautiful animations we've done for each of these episodes. That channel already has 150,000 subscribers, and it's growing really quickly, and there are hours of content available right now for you to binge. New uploads to this YouTube channel will be every single Tuesday. All you have to do is look up @Redacted Mysteries on YouTube, and I'll also be putting a link in the description below. Wondery Plus subscribers can also watch Redacted on the Wondery app. Okay, back to the stories. One night in 2009, a 23-year-old man named Chris, along with his date, walked into a McDonald's in London, England. The following day, Chris had a very important job interview in the morning, and so this dinner in McDonald's was going to be the last part of the date. There were no plans beyond this. This McDonald's was dirty, it was loud, it was packed with people, so not exactly a romantic location for a date, but this was all Chris could afford. In fact, he really needed that job the next day because he just didn't have much money. But for now, this was the best he could do, and so he put on, his best smile and looked at his date like, "Is this okay?" And she kind of looked back and smiled like, "I get it, it's fine, we can eat here." So they hopped in line and they waited, finally got to the counter, they ordered their food and their drinks, and then after receiving them, they turned around and looked for a place to sit down. But as they looked around, they saw every table was taken, literally every one. And so Chris and his date began looking for tables where, there were at least a couple of empty seats. Maybe somebody was sitting there, but they might allow Chris and his date to sit with them. And so they began walking around, and eventually they would find a table where there was just this one guy sitting there. He was sort of minding his own business, just eating his meal. He was not taking up the whole table. And critically, there were 2 seats at this table that were unused. And so Chris kind of tapped his date and pointed to the table. And then the 2 of them walked over, and Chris very politely asked this guy, "Hey, would you mind if we sat here too? We won't bother you. We're just gonna eat and we're gonna get out of here." And the guy just kind of looked at him and he was like, "Sure, go ahead." And so Chris and his date, they sat down and they began eating and chatting, and it was all fine. But as they were eating and chatting, Chris, his mind kept going to the next day. He had that big job interview the next morning, and it was just really the only thing he could think about. In fact, he tried hard to focus on his date, but he was just so anxious about this interview that he just couldn't, and so he found himself not really eating and just kind of waiting for the date to be over so he could just go home, go to bed, and focus on tomorrow. But as he's sort of distracted and his date's chatting about whatever she's chatting about, he realizes the guy they're sitting with is no longer just looking at his food. He stopped looking at his food and he's just staring across the table at Chris's date. And the way he's looking at the date does not seem friendly. And so Chris realizes, okay, what's going on here? Did she say something? Did he say something? And so Chris kind of snaps out of his anxiety about the interview, and he looks at this guy and he's like, "What's going on?" Because again, this guy's just staring at his date. And this guy, sort of unprompted, without even looking at Chris, just begins insulting Chris's date, insulting the way she looked, insulting the way she talked. And Chris is like, what's going on here? He's looking at his date like, did I miss something? Remember, he was sort of distracted a minute ago. But then eventually this guy, he says to Chris's date, you're an ugly pig. And at this, Chris is like, I can't just sit here. And so Chris, who had actually never been in a fight in his whole life, just sort of reflexively stood up and he was like, hey man, get up, like he's gonna fight him here. But as soon as he did that, Chris realized he had made a horrible mistake, because Chris, he was only about 5'8" tall. And this guy, just the way he'd been sitting at the table, Chris hadn't really seen his full stature. And this guy, when he stood up, towered over Chris. But Chris, he was not a scared guy. He hadn't fought before, but he was defending his date's honor here. And he kind of looks up at this guy, and he just kind of winds up and hits him once. But then this huge guy just proceeds to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the McDonald's. The next morning, Chris walked up to this big fancy building in London for his job interview. And Chris was doing his best to be confident, but it was really hard given the circumstances. So the previous night, after Chris had been battered by this total jerk, eventually the guy had stopped and stepped off of Chris, and Chris had gotten back up again, and the guy kind of wandered off and was not held to account in any way. He just kind of left the restaurant and vanished. But Chris, he got to his feet and he looked at his date, and she was totally rattled by it. And Chris was super embarrassed at this point, and he kept apologizing to his date, and she's like, no, it's fine. And they just wanted to get out of there, and so they left the McDonald's, and they both, went to their respective homes. And Chris just went to bed. And then the next morning, when Chris got up early because he has this big job interview, he went into the bathroom and he looked in the mirror and he saw he had this enormous black eye. But even though Chris understood that this very well could affect his chances of getting this job, they're gonna ask about his black eye, and what's he gonna say? Oh yeah, I got in a big fight at the McDonald's last night. There wasn't really a good excuse for it, and he wondered what they would think of him if he showed up looking like this ruffian, But he was like, you know what? This is the biggest opportunity I've ever had. I just gotta go in there, try to be confident, and don't let the black eye define the outcome. And so fast forward to later that morning, Chris goes into the building, he arrives for the interview, and before long, he's having his interview, and he can tell they're all staring at his black eye, but nobody brought it up, which was sort of like worse in some ways. He almost wanted to be able to describe what happened, even though it didn't make him look good. But it was like the fact that they're staring at it and not acknowledging it, it really made him feel awkward. But, Chris did his best. He got through the interview, and by the end of it, he had no idea what the interviewers thought of him or what they thought of his ridiculous black eye, but he thanked them for the opportunity, and he left thinking, I'm not gonna get the job. However, not long after this interview, Chris got some shocking news. He had gotten the job, and it actually might have been because of his black eye. Because this job interview was actually an audition for a starring role in an upcoming TV show. And the character that Chris was auditioning for was this guy who sort of got into fights. And so Chris rolls in here looking like a guy who gets into fights, and they're thinking, oh my goodness, he can hit his lines, he's got the charisma, and look at him. He's even a ruffian himself. He fits the character perfectly. He's our guy. So Chris got cast, and this TV show that he starred in became one of the most popular TV shows in the entire world. And so Chris went from being this guy who could barely afford a dinner at McDonald's to being this amazing actor who was getting nominated for Golden Globe Awards and Emmy Awards. He truly was an A-list star. Today, Chris is better known by his stage name, Kit Harington. And the starring role that he landed that changed his life was the role of Jon Snow in Game of Thrones. One night in 1925, a 21-year-old college student named Ted was inside of his dorm room at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, surrounded by his friends. Ted and his friends had gotten their hands on a bottle of gin, and so tonight they were just sitting around, drinking this gin and having a great time. Now, Ted and his friends knew this was not allowed. Literally they knew this was illegal. It didn't matter that they were 21 years old. At the time, in the United States in 1925, the country was in the middle of Prohibition, which meant no one was allowed to possess or consume alcohol. It was actually illegal. But Ted specifically was willing to take that risk because tonight he wanted to celebrate. Ted was a senior in college and was getting ready to graduate with honors. And also, he had recently been named the editor-in-chief of Dartmouth's humor magazine called Jack-o'-lantern. This was a big deal for Ted. I mean, he had aspirations of graduating and becoming a professional writer and publisher, and it just felt like everything was falling into place, getting this job as editor-in-chief. It was a huge accomplishment. So Ted took a swig from the bottle and passed it around the circle, and before long, he and his friends were all pretty drunk and having a great time, laughing and joking and telling stories. It was a lot of fun, but at some point, they heard a knock on their door. And right away, Ted and his friends went silent, remembering that, oh my God, are we in trouble now? Ted said, no, it's fine. I'm sure it's just, more friends coming to stop by and hang out with us. And so Ted, he gets up, he goes to the door, and, his heart's racing a little bit because he doesn't know who's there. He opens the door, and it's not friends. It's 2 police officers. And so Ted and his friends all got busted for drinking alcohol. However, fortunately for them, the police did not press charges, and so nobody went to jail. And also the school, Dartmouth, decided not to expel Ted or any of his friends. However, they were dealt some pretty severe punishments. Specifically, Dartmouth stripped Ted of all of his academic honors and extracurriculars, which meant he was no longer the editor-in-chief of the Jack-o'-lantern magazine. In fact, he was told by the school that not only was he no longer the editor-in-chief, but he couldn't even submit to put anything in writing into that magazine. He was totally banned. Ted was heartbroken, less so about the academic honors and much more so about being, cut off from the Jack-o'-lantern magazine. He really had attached a lot of value to being the editor-in-chief. He felt like things were going in the direction of him graduating and becoming this professional writer, and so this was sort of a devastating blow. Ted considered fighting with Dartmouth to try to reinstate himself with the magazine, but the more he thought about it, the more he knew that was going nowhere. They were not going to change their mind. However, Ted was not quite ready to just totally give up on this magazine. He knew this magazine did accept submissions from the public, and so he thought, okay, well, I'm not allowed to submit anything to this magazine, but maybe if I come up with a different name, a pen name, then I can submit my work, they won't know it's me, and maybe I can get something published. And so that's exactly what Ted began doing, and the new editor-in-chief of this magazine had no idea this pen name was actually Ted. And so when they received the work from this pseudonym, they thought it was some new person they had never heard of. And they were so wowed by the work, they're like, this is great! And they began publishing all of Ted's work, not realizing it was his. And for Ted, oddly enough, this became in some ways more satisfying than when he was writing under his own name. He kind of liked this pen name. It kind of, fit the vibe of his writing. And so he just continued up with this ruse for the rest of the time he was at Dartmouth, and then after he graduated, he just continued to write under this pen name. Throughout the rest of his life, Ted would write and illustrate over 60 books, all under this pen name, a name he came up with basically just because he got caught drinking in the dorm in college. These books would entertain and inspire generations of people, and in fact, he would even win a Pulitzer Prize for his contribution to American literature and education. Ted's full name was Theodore Geisel, but I'm sure you know him much better by his pen name, which is Dr. Seuss.